Chapter 1249. There are 2 more chapters in the evening. Northwest Frontier Fortress, a lonely city, surrounded by clouds and sand. At dawn, a tall Qi refinement grandmaster pulled the reins and reined in the horse. Looking at the desolate scene of the vast sky and high ground, she felt particularly peaceful. She only had 2 horsemen at her side. Wu Luding and the female sword attendant had parted ways with the Wu clan cavalry a day ago. Under the escort of the white horse Yitzung, they had headed together to the base of the Northern Liang Protectorate that was overseen by Mount Chu. If everything went as expected, this group of top-class swordsmen would serve as the sharpest and most secretive blade tip of the Northern Liang border army. As for the young minister Su Beiji, he had already turned back on his horse. She, Su Fengnian and Sui Shigu continued north. They directly passed through the border defense line of Liangmang and swaggered into the Southern Dynasty's Dragon Waste state. Tantai Pingjing bent down and stroked the soft mane of the horse. This horse was extraordinarily handsome. Indeed, only Bailiang could raise such an outstanding horse. She looked up at the quiet young Prince Liang sitting high on the horse. Along the way, intelligence reports were constantly sent to him. Su Fengnian read them and burned them casually. It seemed that he had not once interfered with the border military affairs. This kind of hands-off boss seemed very relaxed and comfortable. It was as if he could do the job well for anyone who sat in his position. However, Tantai Pingjing was not a frog at the bottom of the well. Since Bailiang claimed to have 300,000 cavalry if they were in a peaceful world, not a person with the surname Su could be the Prince of Peace. The Zhao family of Li Yang would have already cooked the hound. Not to mention, in the current chaotic world, Beimang's million-strong army was pressing on the border. If any mediocre lord who could not convince the masses had the northwest gate, before the Beimang army showed their strength, the Bailiang side would have been in chaos. No matter how many border troops there were, as long as the army's morale was slack, even if they gave Bailiang 300,000 soldiers, they would still not be able to stop the fierce army of Beimang that was released from the cage by the old woman. Su Fengnian's thumb and forefinger subconsciously rubbed the rough reins. He stopped the horse on the slope and looked into the distance. The fire and smoke sank to the west, the valley was quiet and the mountains were empty. But the general could fight 100 battles without the emperor building the Great Wall. This was a frontier fortress poem that was popular in the Central Plains. The poet was a poor scholar with a bright future, but trouble came from his mouth. Because of this poem, the poet was suspected to be cold and charming in the literary world. After the poet returned to the Central Plains to be an official, he wasted more than 10 years in the local officialdom and never got promoted. In the end, he was depressed and resigned. When Su Fengnian first traveled in Jianghu with Huang, he once went to the poet's hometown. Although he was very embarrassed at that time, it was not a problem for him to pretend to be rich and buy a pot of wine to visit. Unfortunately, he only saw the moss and did not see the poet. Su Fengnian gently exhaled a turbid breath. At that time, he only thought that the emperor of the Zhao family must have done something. Later, when he personally experienced some of the officialdom rules, he gradually understood that it was not the man sitting on the throne who was so narrow-minded. It was the local officials who were trying to figure out the emperor's mind. Not to mention the distance, just the nearby Bailiang, how many officials, in order to curry favor with him, often used expensive antiques, calligraphy and paintings to establish a relationship with the Bailiang's Lu family in Qingzhou? How many unknown backdoors did they open for the Lu family's children in Bailiang's officialdom to be unimpeded? Even some of the best teachers in Bailiang's academies favored the Lu family's children who had mediocre literary talent and hoped to establish a relationship with the Lu family and then the Su family. If it were not for Lu Qingyan's opinion, Lu Feiqi, the head of the Lu family, would have used this opportunity to become the leader of Bailiang's literary world. Su Fengnian could not help but feel a little sad. He still remembered the ordinary bamboo lantern that the ancestor of the Lu family gave to Lu Feiqi before he died. He wanted Lu Feiqi to take over the lantern that swayed with the chaotic times and strive to pass it on. Obviously, Lu Feiqi, who had long complained about the family moving to the Baron Bailiang, suddenly found that the Lu family had a great reputation in Bailiang after the process of taking root in Bailiang was too smooth. Not only Lu Feiqi, but the entire Lu family was too complacent and was far less conceited than the old fox Wang Linquan, who was a relative of the emperor. But what really made Su Fengnian depressed was Wang Linquan's obedience. The more the Wang family of the Spring God Lake deliberately tolerated the scholarly Lu family, wasn't it deliberately digging a hole for the Lu family to jump into? Compared to the Lu family's insensibility, Wang Linquan's overt schemes were actually more of a headache for Su Fengnian. But these were difficult to resolve and could not be explained clearly. As the son-in-law of the two families, Su Fengnian could not use his status as the king of Beiliang to bully others. The more he did, the more mistakes he would make. In the end, he could not escape the saying that he favored one and discriminated against the other. Fortunately, these thorny matters were not urgent. Moreover, Lu Qingyan handled things appropriately. Even his second sister, Su Weisheng, admitted that she could not find any flaws in Lu Qingyan. Between women, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, sister-in-law and sister-in-law, these relationships were all like swords and knives that did not see blood. Men were naturally incomparably miserable when they were involved. Su Fengnian, or in other words Beiliang, was facing a great disaster. Ever since Su Shao was conferred the title of king and took over Beiliang, Beimang had been eyeing them covetously. As long as they could destroy Beiliang and bypass the eastern border where Gu Jiantang was overseeing, then the fertile central plains would be like a woman waiting to be slaughtered. How could Beimang, a man who could not endure the hunger and thirst, not risk his life to attack Beiliang? In the past, under the planning of Su Shao and his master Li Yishan, although Beiliang did not have the problem of whether to defend or not, there was still enough space for the Beiliang cavalry to move around. They could take the refugees and retreat to the western regions. They could also retreat to western Shu and Nanzhao as support, enough to fight Beimang to the death. Even if Beimang took over Beiliang, which retreated after the battle went badly, it would be an isolated place with scorched earth. On the contrary, it would increase the supply line of the Beimang army. Beiliang could continue to confront Beimang at the western Shu border and could even harass Beimang in the vast western regions. However, because Qin Jibao was conferred the title of king and entered Beiliang, he cut off the entire western regions of western Shu and Nanzhao. As a result, Su Fengnian and Beiliang had no strategic depth and could only defend to the death. Su Fengnian felt an indescribable sense of guilt deep in his heart. It could not be said that he had let down the Beiliang people, but he felt that he had let down Li Yishan. Chapter 1250. The Northern Liang army was overly optimistic about the Northern Mang royal court's internal affairs. Su Fengnian did not think that this would be able to restrain the military strength of the Northern Mang royal court. With the word advantage in front of them, this was the general trend. As long as the old woman used both kindness and power, she would be suppressed by Tuoba Bodhisattva's great army on one hand, and she would be conferred the title of Marquis on the other hand. She would be able to conquer the Central Plains. It would not take too long for her to truly unite the country and march southward. Sui Xiegu was 100 years old and had traveled to the ends of the earth. He had seen all the emperors, generals and commoners. The affairs of the world could not stir this one-armed old man's emotions. He stood beside Su Fengnian, who was in a daze and felt a little bored. He casually asked, when this old man was young, he did not understand why the generals and soldiers loved to fight. Were they really not afraid of death? The spring and autumn war was easy to understand. People in troubled times were not as good as dogs in times of peace. Life was worthless because they were forced to not take it seriously. Now that Beiliang has been at peace for a long time, can it really stop the million-strong Beimang army? Su Fengnian calmly said, it's simple. Give up one's home for the country and give up one's life for one's home. No one is not afraid of death. It's just that everyone knows that the Beiliang cavalry is not afraid of death. Other than the fact that the Beiliang people are naturally brave, many of them also know that they have no way out. Their home is in Beiliang. If they retreat, the border troops will disperse and the Beimang army will invade the south. Even if they escape from Beiliang, their two legs will not be able to outrun the four legs of the Beimang army. Sui Xiegu curled his lips and mocked, none of you officials are good people. Su Fengnian laughed, don't I have no way out too? Sui Xiegu rolled his eyes and said, with your skills, if you really want to kill people, why don't you go to Dragon Waste State alone and kill them all? Don't tell me that Bodhisattva Tuoba Hongjingyan and the others are following behind you every day? Su Fengnian said indifferently, I can kill like this, but so can the people on the Beimang martial arts ranking. When two countries are at war, this kind of action can't be said to be meaningless, but it really doesn't have much meaning. Of course, if one day Beiliang can no longer defend the Northwest Gate, I will definitely do so. Sui Xiegu was about to speak when he heard Tantai Pingjing snort coldly. The sword-eater old monster immediately shut his mouth. At this moment there was a cloud of dust in the distance. Looking at the route, it seemed that they were going south. They probably saw the 3 horses on the small sand slope. These people with superb riding skills headed straight for the slope. However, they did not act blindly without thinking. Instead, they stopped 500 feet away from the bottom of the slope and looked at Su Fengnian and the other 2 on the slope. This was a Northern Mang elite scout. Judging from his armor and clothing, he wasn't the Crow Palanzi who was equally famous as Northern Liang's wandering crossbowman. He should be the vanguard under Southern Dynasty's great general Lu Gui's direct command. Lu Gui was once praised by the Beimang Empress as being half a Su Shao. He was originally one of the candidates to replace Huang Songpu as the king of the southern courtyard. However, the fatty dong that the old woman mentioned beat him to it. As a scout, regardless of whether it was from the Northern Mang or the Northern Liang, they were all very particular about the rules. Unless they encountered each other on a narrow path, collecting military intelligence under the premise that their whereabouts were not exposed was their first priority. However, if they could casually take the enemy's head, no one would refuse. A rider rushed out of the group of scouts and shot an arrow from 100 paces away. His aim was excellent. The arrow flew straight towards Su Fengnian's head, who was in the middle of the 3 riders on the slope. This barbarian probably wanted to confirm the strength of these 3 riders. If they were not to be trifled with, then he would retreat. If they were just embroidered pillows, then he would kill them and take their horses. Now that the 2 armies of Liang Mang were facing off, the scouts would be the first to exchange lives. Su Fengnian turned his head and dodged the arrow. The scout quickly turned his horse around and retreated. Sui Xiegu stared with wide eyes and asked, "You don't want to eat meat that's delivered to your mouth? Isn't mosquito meat? Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "Naturally, there will be top-notch Bailiang crossbowmen secretly watching us. Right now, Beimang's harassment seems very inexplicable. In order to obtain Beimang's precise motive, I have already paid an immeasurable price. The route of these Beimang scouts is the most valuable clue. As for who is the real bait, it will depend on the strength and luck of both sides." Sui Xiegu said in a carefree manner, "Bent intestines, how unpleasant." Su Fengnian laughed and said, "Do you want Beimang's 1,000,000-strong army to obediently gather in one place and then fight with 30 of us in one go?" Sui Xiegu asked back, "You save the trouble and he saves the trouble. Everyone will be happy. Whoever loses will scram. What else do you want?" Su Fengnian couldn't help but laugh. The northern barbarians really want Bailiang to do that. To be honest, I also want to do that. The old swordsman's words sounded very absurd and amateurish. But if Liang Mang could really be so decisive and leave no room for negotiation, then everyone would be happy. Northern Mang would have the hope of taking down the tiger blocking their way south, and Northern Liang would also have the hope of defeating the Northern Mang army in one fell swoop. Beimang's advantage was very obvious. They had an absolute advantage in terms of numbers, but Bailiang's advantage was that Beimang's army was temporarily leaderless. Although Dong Zhuo was the commander in name, other than the 100,000-strong Dong family army, Hong Jingyan's Ruan Cavalry, Dragon Waste Province's Gusai Province's 5th Army, and Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzhan's personal armies, he, as the king of the south, could not command them as he wished. On the other hand, Bailiang was different. Chu Lushan and Yuan Zuozong could control Bailiang's army. In a confrontation where victory would be decided in one battle, this was where Bailiang's opportunity lay. However, this kind of battle of wills that was equivalent to betting the throne of 2 dynasties was too extravagant for both sides. Su Fengnian looked at the Beimang scouts retreating north and said softly, "Half of Su Shao? No matter who wins or loses this battle, Lu Gui's 40,000 men will all die." Tantai Pingjing asked, "What do you say next? Go to the Governor-General House or continue north?" "Let's go take a look at Beimang's 1,000,000-strong army." Su Fengnian urged his horse down the slope and galloped north. Sui Xiegu, who was following behind, said angrily, "Didn't you just say that such actions are meaningless?" Su Fengnian smiled and turned to look at the tall woman. He acted dumb and asked, "Senior Tantai, did I say that?" Tantai Pingjing said expressionlessly, "No." Sui Xiegu wanted to say something but stopped. He felt really uncomfortable. Su Fengnian started to hum a tune. "The king told me to patrol the mountain. After patrolling the North Mountain, I will patrol the South. He patrolled the East Mountain to kill the passers-by, and patrolled the West Mountain to watch the sun. My king has 3 heads and 6 arms. Oh, I snatched Lil Miss and carried her on my back. I'm so pitiful that I can't swallow the fat meat in my mouth. When will I be able to become a king? Chapter 1251. The 3rd chapter was uploaded in the wee hours of the morning and will not be included in tomorrow's update. 2 chapters tomorrow. The Liang dynasty had 2 anomalies. One was Zhou Xian. Even though he had become a king with a different surname, the soldiers under him still liked to call him Great General. Another one was Gu Jiantang. Although he had not been conferred the title of king or vassal, he had been the Minister of War for more than 10 years. Most of the generals had addressed him as Great General in private. Now he had become the only person in Liang who had a rank of first-class merit. At the border of Liao and Liao, he was still known as Great General. After the Spring and Autumn War came to an end, Gu Jiantang, whose military achievements were slightly inferior to Su Zhao's, was undoubtedly more favored by the nobles of Li Yang's old faction and the new nobles of the dynasty. After Su Zhao's death, the well-deserving leader of Li Yang's army left the capital and took charge of the entire military and politics of the northern lands. Whether it was the authority in Gu Jiantang's hands or his reputation in Li Yang's court, both rose sharply. Even the dullest officials in the capital knew that General Gu Jiantang, who was far from being called an old official, would become a pillar of support for 3 dynasties. It was only a matter of time. Don't forget that Gu Jiantang was also an expert who had entered the martial arts rankings. With his strong body and great energy, it would be too easy for him to last another 20 to 30 years. Therefore, the saying that border generals were envied did not apply to Gu Jiantang. After Gu Jiantang took over the Liao, the eastern front of the Liang dynasty, which had eaten up countless soldiers' salaries and silver, was said to be impregnable. Everyone in the Liao border army followed Gu Jiantang's lead. Especially before Great General Gu resigned as the Minister of War, Great Peace City had some objections to the bottomless Liao soldiers' salaries. After Gu Jiantang left the capital and went to the north, although Gu Lu, which had lost its backbone, started to fall apart, the court's support for the eastern Liao border army became greater and greater. Originally, the court would be hesitant about the rewards for the soldiers at the border, dragging it out and reducing it if they could. Now it was unobstructed and not reduced. With such a general, the Liao border army had a new look and a rare morale. There were even rumors circulating in private that Great General Gu might be able to go one step further. Since Su Xiao was a great general, Su Xiao had been a pillar of the country and he was also one. Then since Su Xiao was a king with a different surname, why couldn't he, Gu Jiantang, be one? Who in the world didn't know that the court was wary of Bailiang, but trusted Great General Gu? The morale of the Eastern Front was high, especially after the northern barbarians brazenly split up their troops. Almost all the generals of the 2 Liao had gone to the general's tent to ask for battle. Since the northern barbarians clearly bullied the weak and feared the strong and decided to attack Bailiang first, why did they dare to challenge us with only 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers? Were they enough to fill the gaps between the teeth of our Eastern Front army? But whether it was the old subordinates who had followed Gu Jiantang during the Spring and Autumn War or the outsiders of Gu Lu who had been steadily rising in the 2 Liao, none of them were able to make the general nod. In the end, many generals were even chased out of the tent by the general who didn't get tired of them. It was about to be winter. The 2 Liao were bitterly cold and the coldness was bone-chilling. On the official road leading to a Wu castle, the leader of the cavalry was a man wearing a slightly old and expensive fox fur coat. Under the fox fur coat was an iron armor that was still as bright as new after many years. Behind him were 200 elite light cavalrymen who were familiar with archery and horses. The man was no longer young. His hair was white, but at a glance, there was no trace of fatigue or lethargy on his body. One could even clearly recognize his iron-blooded temperament that was full of hard edges. It was hard to imagine that a man who was almost 50 years old and had been an official of the capital for more than 10 years still hadn't lost any of his sharpness in the officialdom. On the contrary, those 10 years of hibernation were like 10 years of sharpening a knife. The more you sharpened it, the sharper it became. It must be known that the old fur coat he was wearing had extraordinary significance. Back when the Zhao family ruled the world, the late emperor of Liang rewarded them according to their merits. Countless civil and military officials were promoted and rewarded with wealth and mansions. However, only 3 people were bestowed with fox fur coats by the late emperor. At that time, the only civil official who received this honor was the youngest grand secretary in the history of Liang, the blue-eyed Zhang Julu. The only generals who had helped the Zhao family conquer the world with a blade and a spear were Su Xiao and him. After he gave the talisman knife Nanhua to that interesting young man, he only had the most ordinary frontier army battle knife as a pendant. However, no one dared to deny that he was the #1 expert in blade techniques in the world. Unlike the top swordsmen of Jianghu who each had their own style, the people who used the blade in the world, even those who were crowned with the title of Grand Master, seemed to be miles apart from this person. No wonder Wu Ping said that he alone occupied half of the world's blade intent. A group of travel-worn riders entered the official road from a small path in the west. Behind the man were 2 young military officers with similar appearances. One of them frowned slightly while the other, younger, smiled knowingly. In the entire Liao, only that girl and that madman dared to block the road like this. It couldn't be helped. One of them was their father's most beloved daughter, while the other was half a son and half a son-in-law. These 2 military officers with real power at the border were not the sons of the aristocratic families in the capital who came to Liao to gild their names. They were able to obtain their positions and military power today because of the military merits they gained from climbing through piles of corpses on the battlefield. Gu Donghai and Gu Xishan were sons of the most influential families in the Liang dynasty. However, these 2 young men had started out as ordinary soldiers. After they were promoted to military officers, even their superiors didn't know their true identities. It wasn't until they became military officers in charge of military affairs that they were able to enter the sights of the high-ranking generals of the 2 Liao. At that time they were still the sons of the Minister of War. Only then were they recognized by the generals who were familiar with the capital's officialdom. The man and woman of the cavalry naturally rode side by side with Gu Donghai and Gu Xishan, without any sense of unfamiliarity. Gu Xishan rudely said to that guy, "Madman Yuan, you came empty-handed? You're not paying attention, kid? Aren't you afraid that your future brother-in-law won't pay attention to you?" The young swordsman called Madman Yuan grinned, revealing a mouthful of cold, snow-white teeth. He gestured with his chin at the woman beside him. "What's there to pay attention to? This time your sister almost burned down Wild Goose Castle in Jizhou. Gu Xishan, your family sells vinegar, right? You're such a big vinegar jar. With her ruckus, the entire Liao can smell the vinegar." The woman smiled but didn't say anything. Gu Xishan laughed and said, "You should be content. If it was anyone else who dared to do this, wouldn't the man's thing be castrated to go with wine? Not to mention the women of Wild Goose Castle, even if it was a princess or a princess, she would go up and slap them. This time she was just giving people a hard time. You should be burning incense to thank the gods." Chapter 1252. The young man with the saber at his waist was the #1 saber in the world, South Flower Saber. He wanted to speak, but when he saw the back of the tall man he gave up. No matter how heartless and courageous he was, he did not dare to speak ill of his future wife in front of his father-in-law. Gu Xishan stared and asked, "Yuan Tingshan, did you really come empty-handed?" The young man who now had more than half of the power in Jibei smiled and said, "I just chopped off more than 600 heads of northern barbarians. You want them? I'll send someone to deliver them to you later." Gu Xishan was slightly envious and asked in a low voice, "Yuan Tingshan, why don't I go with you to Ji province? We haven't had a war for many years. Your business seems to be booming. I can even be a military officer for you." Yuan Tingshan, who was popular in both Liao and Ji province, said disdainfully, "Military officer? Don't even think about it. Do you want to be a cart driver or not?" Gu Xishan cursed. Gu Donghai dismissed it with a smile. He had always been amiable to Yuan Tingshan, his brother-in-law. He had never put on airs as a descendant of a famous general, nor had he shown any contempt for the lowly Jianghu people in the eyes of the top nobles. On the contrary, this time, Wild Goose Castle had recognized Yuan Tingshan as their son-in-law. Otherwise, no matter how powerful Wild Goose Castle was in Ji province, they would not dare to fight with the Gu family. Although their father had never verbally acknowledged Yuan Tingshan as his adopted son or son-in-law, he had brought Yuan Tingshan to the capital twice. This was enough to explain everything to the capital and Liao. Gu Jiantang suddenly called out to Yuan Tingshan. The latter quickly patted his horse and followed. The three siblings consciously slowed down their horses. Gu Jiantang said calmly, "You sent a report to Great Peace City." Yuan Tingshan pursed his lips and did not explain anything. Gu Jiantang's tone was still emotionless. "After Donghu marries you, she will no longer be part of the Gu family." Yuan Tingshan felt as if he was struck by lightning, but he still did not want to lower his head. He said in a low voice, "General, don't worry. I can raise her." The corners of Gu Jiantang's mouth seemed to curve into a sneer. Yuan Tingshan pulled on the reins and abruptly stopped the horse. Other than Gu Jiantang, Gu Beihu, who had made up her mind to follow her husband, Gu Donghai and Gu Shishan, who were confused, continued to follow Gu Jiantang to Fort Wu. She asked carefully, "What's wrong? Did you make my father unhappy?" Yuan Tingshan grimaced, looking like he had a headache. The horseman he brought with him also stopped by the side of the road. Yuan Tingshan rubbed his chin and said, "Your father is really interesting. He obviously wants to eat the 200,000 Beimang soldiers, but he wants to be a stone Buddha. Even after I handed over the booklet, it would only benefit your father, but your father still refused. I just can't figure it out. What's the point of being a pillar of the country?" Gu Beihu was shocked. Wasn't that memorial to ask for merit from the Ministry of War? Yuan Tingshan tilted his head and spat. "A few hundred barbarians' heads are nothing to me. I'll feel ashamed if I tell others about it. If I want to do something, I'll do something big. This time I'm helping the Zhao Emperor kill a man. His head is worth a few 100,000 barbarians." Gu Beihu was stunned. Gu Jiantang turned his head and looked towards the south. His eyes were dark and complicated. In the imperial study of Great Peace City, the Emperor of Zhao walked to the center of the study, squatted down and used a pair of tongs to stir the charcoal in the brazier. Beside him, Song Tonglu, the head of ceremony directorate who served the emperor, bent his back and trotted over. His steps were quiet like the steps of an agile cat, but one could see that this successor of Han Xingxian was trembling with fear. There was a memorial in the hand of the emperor of Zhao clan, and Song Tonglu knew it very well. It was sent to him by Yuan Tingshan, a popular figure in Jibei. As for what was written on the memorial when Han Xingxian was still the head eunuch, he could read it first before deciding whether to submit it to the emperor or to the Ministry of War. But now the imperial palace had set up an assistant eunuch, and Song Tonglu did not dare to touch it anymore. The emperor of Zhao family held the memorial and placed it on the burning charcoal. But when he lit a corner, he hesitated and pulled his hand back. He knocked on the edge of the brazier and extinguished the flame. There were 4 or 5 life attendants in the imperial study. They were all quite young and they were still buried in their books. They did not seem to have noticed the strange scene. The charcoal fire shone on the pale face of the emperor of Zhao family. A great eunuch who was allowed to wear a bright red robe said softly outside the room, "Your Majesty, the Right Chancellor of the Imperial College Jean Lanting requests an audience." The emperor of Zhao family's arms hung in the air. He was deep in thought as if he did not hear the voice that was neither soft nor loud. Song Tonglu held his breath and bent down. He did not dare to speak, but he stretched one hand behind his back and waved at the open door. The great eunuch who was also bent down should not be able to see the subtle movement of the ceremony supervisor's palm seal, but he immediately moved back. The emperor of Zhao family slowly came back to his senses and said calmly, "Permission granted." Song Tonglu said softly, "Your Majesty." The emperor of Zhao family grunted in acknowledgement. Soon Song Tonglu quietly brought in a small embroidered stool. The emperor of Zhao family sat in front of the brazier. The memorial was placed on the front lapel of his yellow dragon robe. It was placed on a beautiful dragon that was baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. Jean Lanting, who had a beautiful beard, stepped over the threshold and was about to kneel down when the emperor of Zhao family said softly, "You're excused." The emperor of Zhao family stretched out his hand. Song Tonglu hurriedly brought in another stool. Jean Lanting, who was flattered, carefully sat down after thanking him. The emperor of Zhao family looked at the scholar from Beiliang. The haze between his eyebrows seemed to have lightened a bit. He said pleasantly, "Third young master, do you have something to report?" Jean Lanting's expression was calm and resolute. It was as if he was possessed by a god. He looked like he was about to die. He said respectfully, "I do have something to report. I should have reported it to you, but I think I should still report it to your Majesty face to face." Jean Lanting stood up, bent down and took a few steps back. He knelt down with all his strength and prostrated himself on the ground. He said slowly, "Your humble servant Jean Lanting wants to impeach Grand Secretary Zhang Julu for 10 major crimes." Your humble servant. Grand Secretary. In the imperial study, almost all of the emperor's personal servants trembled. The emperor of Zhao family was silent. In the eastern palace, Crown Prince Zhao Xuan stood alone under the golden birdcage with a dumb parrot. He was whistling happily. He said to himself, his purpose is to be the world's #1 trader since ancient times. He used power to avoid it. Let me calculate how many crimes are there. Controlling the power of the court and acting arbitrarily. Raising a border army for private reasons and squandering the national treasury. Colluding with the powerful eunuch Han Xianxia. Framing the valiant martyr Han family for personal reasons. Not doing enough to govern the country, leading to the restoration of West Chu. And I can't seem to think of anything else even after racking my brains. Speaking of this, the crown prince smiled. It's really been hard on our third young master Jean. Chapter 1253. As Beimang's army moved southward, Liuwa City, which was located at the border of Dragon Waste State, became an extremely eye-catching town. After the previous city magistrate Tao Qianji died without reason, the new city magistrate who replaced him naturally rose in status in the imperial court. However, when he received the news in haste, he was still quite frightened. Leading a few of his personal guards, he rushed out of the city with all his might. However, at the intersection of an official road and a small winding path, he was rudely stopped. The city overseer did not complain at all, only resentfully returning to his residence. On the way back, he didn't need to rush. From time to time, he would turn his head to size up the few solemn cavalrymen. Hey, it's Beimang's self-proclaimed second-best scout, Crow Palanzi. It's said that training a single Crow Palanzi is comparable to training 2 heavy cavalrymen in Biding's imperial tent. Only that fatty was willing to spend so much money. Ever since Dong Zhuo was promoted, he still wore armor when he went out. Even when he went to the imperial court to see Her Majesty, he didn't wear the prominent official robe of the king of the southern courtyard. However, this time he didn't alert any of the border armies. When he arrived near Liuwa City, he changed into this robe that could be said to be second only to one person. He held the small hand of Tao Qinji's daughter, Tao Manwu, and walked to the front of the old and new graves. The old grave was quite old. Although the one lying in it had no relatives or friends, it wasn't overgrown with weeds in the past. This was because when the one lying in the new grave was alive, he would often have people pull out weeds. After he retired from the position of commandant of Chong and became the city magistrate of Liuwa City, he would often visit the grave. Unfortunately, now that he was neighbors with the old guy, he was powerless even if he wanted to. Dong Zhuo was squatted behind him and put a pot of wine at his feet. He first quietly pulled out the yellowed weeds on the old grave and murmured, "Old Corporal, don't blame little fatty Dong. I once swore that as long as I didn't become a rank 1 high official, I wouldn't have the face to visit your grave and toast you. Today this little fatty, can be considered to have struck it rich. Your face is so bright, why don't you grin? What? Do you finally realize that your mouth full of yellow teeth looks terrifying?" Dong Zhuo, who had outstanding military exploits, whether it was chasing or fleeing on the battlefield, even without a warhorse, his 2 legs were faster than 4 legs. However, at this time, it was particularly difficult to pull out the weeds that could be easily understood by young children. The great general and the king of the southern courtyard liked to call the empress sister, and even liked to paste spring festival couplets on people's doors. At this moment, his face was covered in tears. He then wiped his face, his tears and snot, tears and wiped. His face, tears and his nose was unclear. "Corporal, there's a saying ziz, tears in his nose. His tears. And his tears and his tears and his ants. As to what I wear? The is King's Row. S was sests. Old Sergeant, can you believe it? Back then, that little fatty whose legs would go soft whenever he saw a small-scale Northern Liang cavalry, and that little fatty whom you scolded as a coward, was the most senior official among all the soldiers you brought." Dong Zhuo didn't turn his head. He just pointed at the new grave and said, "Look at that bastard Tao Qianji. He's worse than you. He didn't even die on the battlefield. He died just like that. If he's not king deserter, then what is he? Corporal, Can you sleep soundly with this kind of person as your neighbor? In any case, I Dongzhuo won't believe it even if I'm beaten to death. Dongzhuo suddenly turned his head and roared at the new grave. Tao Qianji, I'm scolding you. After the old corporal left, you were the first among your brothers to become a corporal, the first to become a commandant and the first to become a general. You think these are amazing? Bolsh **. The highest-ranking official in your life is the commandant general, the lousy city overseer who left behind a small city. Damn you. Dongzhuo smiled bitterly. I know. You think it's shameful to be with me. That's why you're unwilling to come to the Dong army to help me. Others are just suffering because they want to save face. Look at you. You're dead, aren't you? If you have the ability to crawl out, I'll kick you back. Dongzhuo was probably afraid that he would frighten the little girl kneeling in front of the new grave, so he restrained himself. He unscrewed the lid of the wine pot and took out 3 wine cups from his bosom. He put one on the grave of the old corporal, squeezed out a smile and said to Tao Manwu, Little Manwu, give the cup to your father. With his alcohol addiction, he must be craving for wine after lying down for so long. The little girl took the cup with both hands. Uncle Dong poured her a cup of wine and gently sprinkled it in front of her father's grave. Dongzhuo sprinkled a cup of wine in front of the old grave. He also raised his head and drank a cup. After pouring another cup for himself, he drank it in one gulp. Seeing little Manwu holding the cup with both hands, Dongzhuo smiled and said, I won't let your father drink. I'll just let him lie there and stare. The little girl's eyes were filled with tears, but she tried hard not to cry out loud. He felt wronged and sad. Dongzhuo hurriedly poured a cup of wine for her. Seeing the child seriously sprinkle another cup of wine, Dongzhuo's eyes became sour again. He tilted his head to look at the new grave and said in a low voice, Don't worry, little Manwu is more of a daughter than my own daughter. As long as I conquer Baoyang, if I'm still alive, I won't dare to say that I'll give the entire Central Plains to little Manwu as a dowry, but half of it won't be able to escape. Dongzhuo turned to look at the old grave and said, Old Corporal, are you going to say that I, little fatty Dong, am bragging again? This time you really shouldn't look down on me. Nowadays, if I fart in the imperial court, a lot of people will say that it smells good. Hong Jingyan, Murong Baoding, and the rest of those awe-inspiring bastards, all had to obediently assist me. Isn't the Baoyang cavalry the best in the world? Old Corporal, you have the guts to say that you want tens of thousands of them to die this winter? If even one of them dies, I'll dig a hole next to you and bury myself. I'll be your neighbor. If you really can't say it, you can just tell me in my dreams. Tao Manwu asked for another cup of wine from Uncle Dong. After sprinkling the 3rd cup of wine, he put down the cup and knelt in front of the grave without saying a word. Chapter 1254. Dongzhuo did not let her get up, nor did he console her. He sat down on the ground and poured the remaining wine into the mud. He said softly, Back then you only brought a few soldiers with you. I Dongzhuo have 100,000 soldiers under my command. I also have the best crowbars in Beimang and the best foot soldiers in Beimang. The 300,000 soldiers in the 20 or so military towns in the southernmost prefectures of Gusai and Longyao are under my command. Hong Jingyan's Ruran cavalry and the 100,000 private soldiers of great generals like Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzan are still under my command. Further north, the 2 Jidushi who are holding half of the military tally, 200,000 soldiers, have also obediently handed it over to me. Once His Majesty has cleaned up the grasslands in the north, other than Tuoba, everyone else who has reached the border of the southern dynasties will also be under my command. Baoyang is not that big. With so many people and so many war horses, just a little pea is enough to cause a flood in Baoyang. A big battle before spring and at most a battle during the autumn hunt next year. Baoyang will be completely finished. Dongzhuo laughed sinisterly. Baoyang must think that the battle will last for 3 to 5 years. I Dongzhuo have been a fox for more than 10 years. This time I will be the alpha wolf. I will not rest until I have eaten my fill. Dongzhuo grabbed a handful of mud and threw it away. He stood up and said, Old Deckard, Old Tao, I will take this empty wine pot with me. When I lead the army to the southern border of Liang, I will bring back a pot of mud from there. I will let you 2 country bumpkins who have never even been to Baoyang see what kind of fertile soil can grow rice. Dongzhuo stood up and looked at young Manwu who was still kneeling. He bent down and rubbed her little head. He said softly, We should go. The little girl stood up and silently raised her arm to wipe away her tears. Zhou thought for a moment and lowered his head to look at the luxurious robe he was wearing. He took it off, folded it neatly and placed it between the two graves. He said indifferently, "Returning home in glory, no one will look at me." "Then why are you still wearing it?" Zhou placed young man Wu on his shoulder and left in large strides. He smiled and said, "Young man Wu, didn't uncle give you a pony? Very soon, you will be able to cross the river with our million-strong army." Iron horses and ice rivers entered the central plains. When the news spread throughout the capital, Great Peace City was not in an uproar. Everyone was silent out of fear. It was not easy to live in the capital. However, the right chancellor of the Imperial College, Jean Lanting, who had risen to the top in just a few years, listed out the 10 major crimes and impeached none other than the founder of the Liang dynasty, Grand Secretary Zhang Julu. Most of the people in the capital felt that this outsider had truly gone mad. Challenging Grand Secretary Zhang, if this wasn't throwing an egg against a rock, what was it? During these dozen or so years, the people who wanted the Grand Secretary to lose his position could be said to have come one after another. Every now and then they would jump around a few times. However, most of the time the Grand Secretary didn't even bother to give them a proper look. Meanwhile, these people who overestimated their own abilities were all important figures who could shake the capital with a stomp of their feet, all of them deeply rooted. However, who succeeded? Moreover, their appetites weren't that great. They only wanted that green-eyed child to take off his official robe, not daring to have this #1 civil official of Liang Imperial Court meet the late emperor. Of the 10 great crimes, the one that everyone believed in the most was actually the one that forced the death of Ji Province's Han family. This was indeed a secret matter passed down by the father-son-in-law Grand Secretaries. Jean Lanting used the 8 words "lantern light continues, endless salary," to describe Zhang Julu's political reform. It could be said to be incomparably accurate. Meanwhile, what was worth pondering over was the crime of colluding with the powerful official Han Xianxia, leading to a foul atmosphere in the inner and outer courts. Now that the human cat Han Xianxia was already dead, how was the Grand Secretary going to defend himself? However, the one that carried the most destructive force was also the one that left everyone feeling the most inconceivable. It wasn't privately raising the 2 vast border armies, but rather the last of the 10 great crimes. After ruling for more than 10 years, he opened up a large amount of salt and iron, pouring all of his energy into the northwest. When this news quickly settled down, it seemed like it quickly disappeared without a trace, but more and more people began to chew on the hidden meaning within. Even though the Grand Secretary still participated in the court assembly every day, when he needed to stay overnight, he would definitely be on duty in the Minister province, handling all types of government affairs still in an orderly manner. However, it wasn't strange for the Grand Secretary's residence to be completely deserted. After all, the Grand Secretary had never liked to privately meet with guests. However, the great residences on the same street as the Grand Secretary also began to be deserted, making the onlookers' imaginations run wild. More importantly, this time, Zhang Julu didn't strike like he did against Zhao Xiangui. Bai Yan didn't react at all to the ungrateful and mad dog biting of 3rd Jean, the right chancellor of the Imperial College. At the same time, there was one matter that had to be mentioned. That was Yin Maochun, who had the title of Hidden Minister and was in charge of the evaluation of local officials this year, had quietly returned to the capital ahead of time. The emperor and the crown prince paid a visit to Qi Yonglong's mansion. Huan Wen claimed that he was sick and didn't participate in the court assembly. Immediately after, the sound of winter thunder rang out in Great Peace City. General Yang Shenxing, who had been caught by the West Chu rebel army and was covered in dirt, secretly went to Great Peace City to prove that the Grand Secretary Zhang Julu had framed the Han family in the past and wasn't wrong. On the day of the beginning of winter, the emperor personally led a group of Great Peace City officials to welcome the winter in the northern suburbs. Among the nobles, other than Huan Wen, who still didn't appear, all the officials in the capital led by Zhang Julu were present. Thus, there was no morning court assembly for the beginning of winter. However, after the beginning of winter, there would be a grand court assembly. The Son of Heaven would bestow jackets to the officials, implying that he sympathized with the officials to protect them from the winter cold. On this day, Tantanon, who had gotten up early before the sun rose, sat alone in the study and stared blankly at the sky outside the window for a long time. The sky gradually brightened. The old man went to the bookshelf and took out a handwritten book that his teacher had given him. He ground the ink himself and shakily wrote a line of words on the title page of the handwritten book. He planned to have the steward of the residence send it to the Grand Secretary's residence. Winter's getting colder. Old friend, please wear more clothes. After writing, the old man started to stare blankly again. Then an old steward of the residence stumbled into the study with a pale face. He said sorrowfully as if the sky had fallen, "Master, the Grand Secretary said in the court assembly that the 2 generations of the Su family have guarded the Northwest for more than 20 years and have worked hard. Su Fengnian has inherited his father's work and is loyal. He should be made a pillar of the country. What should we do? Why did the Grand Secretary do this? Most importantly, His Majesty didn't get angry. Although he didn't agree to the pillar of the country, after the imperial edict was rejected, he once again bestowed the new Prince Liang a pillar of the country." Huan Wen waved his hand expressionlessly, indicating for the old steward to leave. The study returned to silence. Huan Wen gently closed the precious handwritten book that had been opened and muttered, "Old man, I can only burn it for you." Chapter 1255. There's one more chapter in the morning, not included in tomorrow's update. 2 more chapters for tomorrow. In the winter, the water outside the Great Wall dried up and the grass turned yellow. To be able to come across a little bit of tenacious greenery was exceptionally pleasing. The 3 of them stopped their horses by the bank of a water source. If they rode straight north for 3 days, they would be able to see the tiled city. Su Fengnian squatted down, scooped up a handful of water and splashed it on his face. He exhaled deeply. Sui Xiegu, who was not familiar with military affairs, asked casually, "Are these northern barbarians out of their minds? Why don't they station their troops at the border in early autumn? Didn't these nomadic barbarians who lived on horseback invade the central plains in autumn to plunder the harvest? What's the point of plundering in winter?" Su Fengnian could not help but laugh. Tan Taiping explained calmly, "What you're saying is the general situation. In the past, the nomadic tribes brought great damage to the central plains. Most of them came south in winter, taking advantage of the frozen river to allow the cavalry to pass unimpeded. At the end of the Dafeng dynasty, the northern barbarians used this opportunity to invade the central plains." Su Fengnian continued, "The relationship between the grassland nomads and the central plains farming dynasties is like that of a wolf and a tiger. The latter always has the initiative. Whenever the latter is in a state of exhaustion due to the alternation between prosperity and decline, they are like a young tiger, a sick tiger, or a tiger that is about to die of old age. That's when the northern barbarians are at their strongest. Therefore, every time there is a civil war in the central plains, the northern barbarians will invade the border and take advantage of the situation. But in the end, from the Great Qin to Liang, it was the central plains dynasties that suppressed the northern barbarians. You have to know that the official history of the Great Qin recorded that 5 barbarians were equal to 1 Qin soldier. The official history of the Dafeng dynasty also said that the barbarians were skilled in Qin, but 3 of them were equal to 1 Dafeng soldier. That is to say, even if the northern nomads had obtained many forging techniques from the Great Qin dynasty, 3 of them were only equal to 1 Dafeng soldier. But today, Beimeng relies on the southern dynasty that has absorbed countless people from the spring and autumn period. In the central plains, only the elite troops of Zhao Yi, the Prince of Guangling, and Zhao Bing, the Prince of Yanqi, dare to claim to be equal to the Beimeng. Sui Xiegu could not help but ask, "Is the Liang dynasty not strong enough to unify the central plains? Didn't they say that Li Yang was as powerful as the Great Qin?" Su Fengnian laughed and said, "If the current emperor had not been in a hurry to show the world his great talent and strategy when he first ascended to the throne, and had not fought those wars with Beimeng, and had instead calmly digested the strength of the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn, then it would not have mattered at all whether our Beimeng had 300,000 soldiers or not. At most, it would have been the icing on the cake." Sui Xiegu glared and said, "Is that Emperor Zhao's brain flooded with water? At that time there were no strategists to dissuade him?" Su Fengnian said helplessly, "At that time the odds between Li Yang and Beimeng were 50 to 50. Who would dare to carelessly persuade them? What's more, the Zhao family's son of heaven wanted to rely on his military exploits to suppress a large number of famous generals, led by my father and Gu Jiantang. In this world, how can there be such a clear distinction between right and wrong between people and matters? Take me for example, I am Su Zhao's son. In my eyes, Zhou Xian is naturally a king of a different surname who did not commit any major crimes but had countless great achievements. In the eyes of Crown Prince Zhou Xian and the other princes, the current emperor must be the most diligent and caring emperor in the history of Liyang. Back then, when Zhao Kai wanted to kill me at the Marsh of Reeds, I also wanted to go to Iron Gate Pass to kill him. Between the two of us, neither of us is a person who has committed the most heinous crimes. It's just that there's no other way. At that time we were both chess pieces, pawns that were pushed across the river. Sui Xiegu mocked. Oh, from your tone it seems like you've turned into a chess player today? Su Fengyan smiled and did not reply to old ancestor Qi Jian's sarcasm. He stood up and looked towards the north. On the line there was the military town of Huazhujun Shijing Golden Toad State, and further north was the Beimang royal court. Tantai Pingjing, who was dressed in the white robes of a Qi refinement warrior, suddenly said, "To the nomadic tribes, isn't a strong and stable Central Plains dynasty also a disaster? Once the ruler of this dynasty admires Bian Gong, he will be surrounded by a group of talented generals who hope to spread their whips across the desert." The reverse is also true. Even if the Liyang dynasty is destroyed and the monarch with the surname changes one after another, the battle between the nomadic tribes and the farming dynasty will not change. Su Fengyan shook his head and said, "Yes." Tantai Pingjing was in disbelief. "Yes?" Su Fengyan stretched out a finger and pointed to the north. "As long as we can conquer this land, we can then build several great chain roads that run through Beimang." Tantai Pingjing's face was full of disbelief. "Are you crazy?" Su Fengyan narrowed his eyes and said softly, "I am not crazy. If one were to talk about crazy, then that would be the young Grand Secretary who was in charge of the country at that time." Back then Su Xiao and Gu Jiantang argued endlessly about who to choose to guard the northwest gate. On the surface, both Grand Secretaries resolutely opposed my father being the ruler of a different surname. However, I only learned of an inside story much later. Among the opposition, someone convinced the old Grand Secretary who had retired from his official position and returned to his hometown but still retained his authority. This person was Zhang Julu. Because this civil official who had never joined the army had an ambition that all military generals could not imagine. The young Grand Secretary wanted to use Bailiang as the outpost to attack Beimang, and use the Bailiang cavalry as the main force to attack Beimang. This would reduce the loss of military strength and supply pressure of Liyang as much as possible. Under this premise, Grand Secretary Zhang would have the imperial court acquiesce to the Su family's limited infiltration of Shishu and Nanzhao. Chapter 1256. Su Fengyan slowly said, "In a situation where this young Grand Secretary and Bailiang both sides are well aware of, there are many things that cannot be resisted. Among them, the Han family that is filled with martyrs is too stubborn and conservative, also not wishing to use their entire family's foundation as a wedding dress for Bailiang's Su family. Once they compromise, the Han family's status as the northern military's mainstay will disappear. Then the Han family that has fought against the northern nomads for generations will also quickly become a thing of the past. You have to understand that when the Su family died, the Han family's head was still drinking and chatting merrily with my father, these two close friends. If I remember correctly, the first matchmaker I met wasn't that prince consort, but rather a little girl from the Han family who still had goat horns. She was behind her father, half of her face exposed, making a face at me." Su Fengyan's hands withdrew into his sleeves. At first things didn't fall apart. The Han family also put in a lot of effort. Then Yuan Binshi stuck his foot in, viciously dealing with Zhang Julu. By the time my father mobilized the armored cavalry, crossed the border to rescue the Han family children, everything was already too late. Su Fengyan looked towards the sky. "When I was young I would often dream of that goat-horned girl, half of her face covered in blood, always crying, telling me that it hurt." Su Fengyan said in self-mockery, "In the past I was most afraid of having nightmares about her. Later on, when I wanted to dream about her again, there was already no way." Su Fengyan's waist bent slightly as if he couldn't bear the burden, but also as if he remembered someone. "When I was young I didn't understand anything, saying a lot of things out of anger. I even said something to Su Zhao's face, roughly saying that I became Su Zhao's son, that it was 8 lifetimes of bad luck, that I was like this, that my mother was also like this. When I grew up, only then did I realize that Su Xiao actually already couldn't have done any better. Everything he could give me as a father he already gave me. He always talked about how high-spirited he had been when he was young, how many victories he had won and how much glory he had enjoyed. At that time, I always didn't have the patience to listen to him talk about these old and rotten grains. When I got impatient I would say, Su Xiao, a real man doesn't boast about his past achievements. Let's not blabber on and on, okay? All the smart people in the world laughed at Su Xiao for being a fool. He helped the late emperor conquer the world, but in the end he had to guard against his son like he was guarding against a thief for 20 years. In fact, everyone was well aware that Su Xiao would not rebel. If he wanted to rebel, the Central Plains would have long been divided into 2 rivers. But the more this was the case, the more Li Yong would take a yard after taking an inch. That was why the Zhao clan's son of heaven had Zhao Kai take the bottle to the western regions, had Qin Jibao cut off Beiliang's path of retreat, and forced the Su family's 300,000 cavalry to fight Beimang to the death. The Zhao clan's son of heaven used this method to help his son wear the dragon robe. In Zhao Zhuan's court, among his officials, there would be no martial artist Su Xiao whose achievements shook the emperor. There would be no scholar Zhang Julu who cared about the people of the world. Within his territory, there would be no border officials who couldn't get rid of him. There would be no vassals who coveted the dragon throne. There would only be a severely weakened Beimang left behind for his son to complete the great undertaking that the Great Qin and Great Feng dynasties couldn't accomplish. Su Xiao once said that the current son of heaven's magnanimity was far inferior to the late emperor, but he could be considered a good emperor. As Su Fengyan spoke, he squatted down and grabbed a handful of yellow sand, holding it tightly in his hand. Sui Xiegu sighed softly. Tantai Pingjing suddenly turned around and looked into the distance. There were a dozen or so riders approaching. Their armor was stained with blood and their weapons and crossbows were broken. Su Fengyan stood up. When the dozen or so riders who originally wanted to use this precious water source to quickly replenish themselves saw the 3 people, they seemed to be conflicted. If there was no water, they and their warhorses wouldn't be able to withstand the pursuit of the enemy's black fox bars from several li away. The rider at the front waved his hand and charged towards the water source. The exhausted 14 riders dismounted from their horses. When they were filling their bags with water and the warhorses were brushing their noses, there were people carefully watching Su Fengyan and the other 2 in case anything unexpected happened. This place was already far away from the Beiliang border of the southern dynasty. The probability of encountering their own people was about the same as encountering the northern barbarians in Beiliang territory. These 14 riders were all elite riders with light armor and light crossbows. They were all tall and sturdy and their horsemanship was exquisite. They also had the latest generation of cold blades at their waists. It could be seen that they were the best crossbowmen in the Beiliang frontier army. However, this time they had probably encountered an enemy force of at least 100 riders. All of them were injured. One of the warhorses had reached the water source and swayed a few times before dying on the spot. The rider held back his tears and didn't look at his beloved warhorse. Without a word, the 2 riders beside him exchanged for a less damaged crossbow for him. This crossbowman who had lost his mount and was destined not to return to the border alive was even less likely to return on the same horse as his comrades. That would only cause the death of another comrade. This rider carried the light crossbow on his back and touched the cold blade at his waist. He grinned at the other crossbowmen and then turned to face the black fox bars that were pursuing them and intercepting military intelligence. At this moment, the leader of the crossbowmen, who had already mounted his horse, saw the young man with an extraordinary bearing. He smiled and said, "I'll give you 3 horses in exchange for a cold blade. How about it?" The man who looked like the leader of the crossbowmen was taken aback. He asked, "You're also from Liangzhou?" Su Fengyan nodded. "I'm a native of Liangzhou." The leader of the crossbowmen quickly said, "If that's the case, I can lend you my cold blade. However, I hope that young master can come find me at Wolf Sealing Pass later. My name is Zhu Geng. This time my brothers and I owe you our lives. Young master's steeds are all priceless. Even if we sold everything we had, we still wouldn't be able to afford them. Zhu Geng definitely won't be able to repay this favor in this lifetime. Zhu Geng isn't a hypocritical person. I only dare say that in the future, I'll kill 30 more northern barbarian bars for young master." Zhu Geng turned to the rider who had clearly gone to his death. "Li Tingji, get back here. Get on my horse and return to Wolf Sealing Pass with me." Su Fengyan gave the 3 horses to Zhu Geng. When he handed over the reins, he said something that Zhu Geng didn't understand. However, he didn't have the time to think about it. 1 crossbowman for 50 riders. I owe you 36 lives. The 14 riders cupped their fists in thanks. Zhu Geng didn't forget to remind him, young master, be careful. There are 60 Black Fox barbarians and 300 Beimang light cavalry about 2 li behind us. Su Fingyan nodded. After the 14 crossbowmen were far away, he looked at the 2 battered war horses. He turned to Tantai Pingjing and Sui Xiegu and said, I'll have to trouble the 2 seniors to send these 2 horses to Wolf Sealing Pass. Then wait for me at the Governor-General's residence. Sui Xiegu was about to speak when he saw Tantai Pingjing's cold glare. He could only swallow his words. Su Fingyan's right hand held the borrowed Bailiang blade and slowly walked forward. His left hand, which had been holding a handful of sand, loosened its fingers. Yellow sand scattered into the air. He slowly walked towards the 300 riders. Next spring, the loquat tree in a small courtyard would sprout new buds and bloom new flowers. The next spring would be the same. However, he didn't know if he would be able to see it with his own eyes. Chapter 1257. During the wars of the spring and autumn period, scouts were the sharpest antennae of an army. They were rarely deployed on such a large scale. However, on the border of Liangmang it was the exact opposite. Scouts rarely went out alone to capture military intelligence. The reason was very simple. Both sides were at the peak of the use of scouts. Whether it was the degree of importance or the speed of attrition, it far exceeded that of the Central Plains. It had reached a level that the generals of the Central Plains found exaggerated. Once the 2 sides met, it often meant that one side was destined to be completely wiped out. When both sides had roughly the same level of individual combat and tacit cooperation, the number of people would determine who could leave the battlefield with important military intelligence. Northern Liang border army's wandering crossbowmen shook the world under the heavens, while Northern Mang wasn't inferior in any way. Dongzhua's crowbar, Huang Songpu's roaming scout personally created in the past, as well as the Black Fox Bar, who was known as the son of great General Lu Gu, were all the most outstanding scouts of the present age. Crossbowman Captain Zhu Geng led 50 cavalry deep into the heart of the desert. It was not only luck but also strength. After deducing a spy report through observation, he was intercepted and killed by Heihu Lanzi on his way back. Then not only did the second Lanzi quickly join in the pursuit, Lu Gui, one of the commanders of the border army of the southern dynasties, received the report and did not hesitate to mobilize 300 light cavalry nearby. He was determined to catch this fish that had escaped the net. The cold wind whistled and the war flag fluttered. In a heavily guarded military tent, General Lu Gui's brows were tightly furrowed. He squatted beside a pot that was about to boil. During this period of time he rarely looked at the map of the Bailiang border that countless spies had sacrificed their lives for. It was not that Lu Gui's power had fallen, nor was it that this famous general did not value the Bailiang cavalry. It was that even he, as the commander of the border, did not know where his side was going to focus on until 3 days ago. He did not know which unlucky place in the 3 northern provinces of Bailiang would be the breakthrough point for the army. Although the Murong and Yelu families were busy with their own affairs due to the turmoil in the grassland in their backyard, as one of the 2 pillars of the southern dynasties, the old Longguan aristocrats had always been at odds with the new military nobles represented by Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzhan. This time they even jumped and cursed in the imperial court of the western dynasties and attacked together, begging the emperor to take back Dongzhua's military power. Huang Songpu had already retired and returned to his hometown, but he was almost dragged out and whipped by these angry Chinese tycoons. Could be seen how chaotic the southern dynasties was at the moment. The key was that General Dongzhua had been hiding all this time, as if he was determined to let the army of nearly 1 million consume their provisions in vain. Even if Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzhan wanted to say a few words for him, they could not. Instead, they would only add fuel to the fire. Lu Gui was temporarily in charge of the border defense military affairs of all the military towns in Gusai province. During wartime, even the prefect of discipline who had the same rank as him had to listen to him. This was a special case that had never happened in the history of Beimang. This was also a great privilege that the emperor had given to General Dongzhua. It should be noted that Beimang was different from Liyang and the Central Plains. The prefect of discipline who controlled the mighty army was definitely not an administrator or a provincial governor. Thinking of this, Lu Gui had already smelled the unique aroma of brick tea, goat milk and butter tea leaves mixed together. Lifting the lid of the pot, this general who used to be from a noble family in the Central Plains was in a good mood. He grabbed a handful of salt and threw it into the pot. Different from General Yang Yuanzhan who used to be a slave, and also different from Huang Songpu who had a glorious ancestor, Lu Gui's family was not in the upper class among the remnants of the northbound tribes. However, after arriving in the southern dynasties of Beimang, they would not be wantonly slaughtered like pigs or dogs. Lu Gui's status today was attributed to his hard study in the old country when he was young. It was also attributed to the military strategies he had read in those books. Because of him, Lu Gui's family had a second spring in Beimang. He was also worthy of the name of the resurgence of the family tree. However, after Lu Gui became famous, he was not like many of the remnants of the spring and autumn period who were nostalgic for the past or the extravagant nobles of Beimang who never drank the famous tea from the Central Plains. After arriving in Beimang, Lu Gui fell in love with the milk tea in the pot in front of him. He liked the strong fishy smell of goat milk and horse milk. After scooping a bowl of tea, Lu Gui put it to his nose and sniffed it. He held the bowl with one hand and slowly turned it. The descendants of his family seemed to be drinking a famous tea from the spring god lake. They did not hesitate to spend a lot of money. There were even young people who said that after conquering the Central Plains, they must have their own tea plantation on the island of the spring god lake. The general laughed. These children did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Did they really think the Central Plains was made of paper? Even if the Central Plains were easy to bully, how could they cross the threshold of Beimang? He was afraid that when the time came, Beimang would have to break a leg to cross it. Next, in the south there was Qin Jibao who was sitting on a natural stronghold. This person used troops to turn something rotten into something magical. If he had 30,000 soldiers, he would be able to fight 100,000 strong soldiers. Moreover, on the eastern front, there was also the famous general of the spring and autumn period, Gu Jiantang. This time, the Guangling Road's internal strife had left the eastern front completely unscathed. Lu Gui stopped turning the teacup and said to himself, "In the end, the true enemies of Beimang's million-strong army are three people: Su Fengnian, Qin Jibao, and Gu Jiantang. Which one of them is easy to deal with?" Lu Gui drank a mouthful of tea. When it was bland, he threw in some salt and called out, "Lin Fu." A resolute general who had been waiting outside the tent lifted the curtain and walked in. Lu Gui raised the teacup in his hand. "Want a cup? I might not be in the mood in the future." The middle-aged general shook his head. Lu Gui did not force him. This fellow was his trusted aide and was once the main general of the Black Fox Guard. Later, Lu Gui felt that it was a waste of talent and gave him two options. He could either become a third-rank general with real power in his own army and continue his military career, or he could go to the Xijing Ministry of War as an assistant minister and live a peaceful life as an official. In the end, this fellow chose neither and insisted on being an ordinary guard. Lu Gui sighed in his heart. This man had seen life and death countless times. Why couldn't he let go of the meaningless word, love? "My daughter is already married and I have a basket full of children. What's the use of you, Lin Fu, staying by this old man's side?" However, Lu Gui, who had never been sentimental, knew that these words were too hurtful and could not be said out loud. Lu Gui asked, "What about the Bailiang crossbowmen?" Lin Fu said in a low voice, "Don't worry, they won't be able to escape back to Bailiang. Moreover, even if they are lucky enough to find something, they will only think that our army is moving out to attack Liuzhou." Lu Gui raised his head, his expression solemn. He seemed to have lost his previous amiability, but he also did not deliberately reveal his power. Chapter 1258. However, Lin Fu was instantly covered in sweat. He lowered his head and said, "General, apart from the Black Fox Guards and 300 personal cavalry, I also asked for a master expert from the Spiderweb spies. There is also news that the daughter of Jade Cicada Prefecture's governor, Princess Hong Hu, has followed." Lu Gui nodded and stared at this fellow. "Luckily you didn't drink that cup of tea. Otherwise I would have whipped you 10 times. Lin Fu, who was famous as one of the young generals in the South Dynasty, smiled awkwardly. He was like a child who had made a mistake and was almost beaten by Mr. Strict. Lu Gui drank a mouthful of strong tea and said softly, "As a general, perhaps a single wrong decision can cause many people to die. Lin Fu, do you know why the king of Bailiang doesn't care when people call him a butcher? Do you know what he feels guilty about?" Lin Fu shook his head. "I can't guess what the king of Bailiang is thinking." Lu Gui said softly, "Butcher is a title for killing millions of enemies. As a leader, being called that doesn't hurt at all. It's about the same as me whipping you 10 times. But if because of his own carelessness he caused the death of the soldiers under his command who should have been able to survive, that would be unsettling." Lin Fu said softly, "General, I'm just a small personal guard. You can say that to Fatty Dong of the King of the North Court." Lu Gui was both angry and amused. He said helplessly, "I know you guys don't like Dong Zhuo. However, he does have true ability. In the future you bunch of brats should stop talking so weirdly. Scram." Lin Fu left the tent. Behind him came Lu Gui's orders. "Send my orders. The commander's tent will move south and follow the army to Lu Prefecture." Lin Fu turned around and asked, "General, you're not going to finish that pot of tea?" Lu Gui asked calmly, "Then how many heads do my Lu brothers have to cut off?" Without another word, Lin Fu ran off to pass down the order. As he ran, he shouted, "Great General, from now on, I won't be a personal guard anymore. Last time we agreed that I would be a third-grade general. Other than the 20,000 soldiers, the Black Fox Pen would also be under my command. If you don't say anything, I'll take it as a silent agreement." Lu Gui smiled and took the opportunity to drink another bowl of tea. Because within a month, there were people from all walks of life who left their original stations and rushed to the border of the two prefectures. After they arrived, the Ministry of War in Xijing did nothing for a long time, and complaints were heard everywhere. As a result, 3 days ago, Dong Zhuo, the king of the South Courtyard, finally began to take action. Moreover, once he took action, it was dazzling. Even Lu Gui was surprised. The personal troops of border commander Lu Gui set out to kill their way to Luzhou. The coquettish woman, who treated this bloody pursuit as a chance to relax, stood on a high slope and raised her eyebrows. Beside her stood an old man in a brocade robe with an outstanding bearing. His nickname was the Dragon King. Beimang's devil was ranked 9th, but the Jianghu of Beimang acknowledged that this old man's ranking was too low. The noble woman of Beimang with a mink forehead was even more convinced. An old man who even the 6 great officials of the spider web had to respectfully address as martial uncle was ranked 9th? What a joke. She was the famous Princess Hongyan of Beimang's royal court. She was said to have countless male companions. Her father was the governor of Jade Cicada Prefecture, but he was punished by the emperor because of a slip of the tongue. She seemed to be the most aggrieved of the 8 governors, but she was still one of the most favored descendants of the Murong Empress. When she was still a little girl, she followed her father to the capital to meet the emperor. The empress, whose hands had not been washed clean of the blood of the yellow dragons, would smile as she held Princess Hongyan in her arms and let the child stand on her knees. That scene was unforgettable to many of the elders of the Yelu and Murong royal families. It was only at that time that people remembered that the woman was a woman. This infamous proud daughter of heaven had once personally gone to Liao City to pass a message to the city magistrate Tao Qianji. It's not appropriate to go out during the Qingming festival. However, Tao Qianji did not listen and died in the heavy rain of the Qingming festival. She looked at the confrontation in the distance with a great disparity in numbers and asked, "Old Dragon King, why does that figure look so familiar?" The old man in brocade clothes smiled. "Just by looking at his figure, he looks a bit like that handsome young man who was teased by the princess on the streets of Tuma Pass." The mink forehead Princess Hongyan laughed. "I remember now. He does look a bit like that guy. I even smacked his butt." In the distance, the lone man with the saber did not show any signs of dodging. He just went straight for the charging Black Fox Lanzi and the 200 light cavalry. The old man in brocade clothes narrowed his eyes. But just by looking at his aura, it's like the difference between heaven and earth. If the princess doesn't think that this old servant's eyesight is bad, we should turn around and leave as far as we can. Princess Hongyan was shocked. That guy is a profound finger realm expert at such a young age. But even if his profound finger realm is healed, he might not be able to escape from you and 400 cavalry. Princess Hongyan asked, "Tian Xiang? Is there such a person in Baoyang? Yuan Baixiong is younger and older than him. He doesn't have the leisure to come here for a stroll." The old man in brocade clothes shook his head. "If I'm not wrong, it's that guy." Then the old man turned around and left. However, Princess Hongyan did not move because she knew who the old Dragon King was talking about was. He did not want to leave even more. The old man stopped and said with a frown, "Princess, you will really die. That person has already discovered us. This old servant's leaving is just doing my best and leaving the rest to fate. This will let that person know that we have no intention of interfering." With her back to the Dragon King, the mink forehead woman waved her hand with a smile. "Old Dragon King, you go. I have to see this legendary person with my own eyes. I have to confirm. If he is really that young master I took advantage of back then, I will have profited even if I die here today. Also, Old Dragon King, don't even think about knocking me out." The old man sighed. If Princess Hongyan was determined not to leave, there was no point in him leaving. He did have the thought of knocking her out just now. She muttered, "A good show is about to begin. Old Dragon King, do you really not want to see this person's elegance with your own eyes? Perhaps if you miss it once you will miss it forever." The old man did not say anything. He had already arrived beside Princess Hongyan and looked into the distance together. There were more than 70 Black Fox guards and 300 iron guards of the Lu army. In the eyes of this cavalry, this ant blocking their path would be killed in a single charge. Their real mission was to intercept and kill the 14 crossbowmen. Su Fingyan had been holding his blade with his left hand all this time. He did not draw his blade with his right hand. He stopped, flicked his wrist. The cold blade in his left hand was unsheathed. The scabbard stabbed into the sand beside him. His left hand held the blade in a reverse grip. Chapter 1259. Looking at the scene on the other side of the narrow path, the old man in embroidered clothes asked, "Princess, are you not afraid of death?" The mink forehead woman was clear-minded and said, "Let's go." The Baimang spiderweb elder grabbed her by the shoulder and flew down the slope. They didn't stop until they were 200 feet away from the point of collision. Along the way, Princess Hongyan still had the mood to turn her head and admire the charging posture of those northern Mang cavalrymen. Their vigorous bodies rose and fell along with the horse's back, just like a person's breathing. It was filled with a kind of dynamic beauty that was pleasing to the eye. The curved blades in the hands of the Baimang soldiers had a larger arc than the cold blades. This kind of arc gave the Baimang war blades a greater cleaving force. Combined with their height and their innate strength that exceeded that of the men of the Central Plains, a single cleave of their blades was like a hot knife through butter. Princess Hongyan heard the rough shouts of the Baimang men. She firmly believed that this kind of sound would resound throughout the Central Plains. It wasn't something that a master of the martial arts role could block, nor was it something that the 300,000 soldiers of Baimang could block. She stroked the mink forehead and looked into the distance with narrowed eyes. She saw that the person blocking the path of the millions of soldiers of the Baimang dynasty held the cold blade in a reverse grip and held it horizontally in front of his chest. A crack seemed to have appeared at the height of the horse's chest among the 3 Black Fox riders in the front row, which then expanded in an instant. The war horses and riders continued to charge forward, but they were cut in two. The lower half of the warhorse and the rider's legs fell to the yellow sand, while the upper half of the warhorse and the rider whose legs had been cut in an instant fell to the ground further ahead. It wasn't just the front row. The dozen or so rows behind them were also in a similar situation. On the path 100 steps in front of the machete man, a large patch of blood instantly bloomed. Half of a warhorse's body with its stomach exposed, slid forward while sticking to the sand. Behind the corpse of the warhorse was a ghastly bloody path. After the 30 or so riders whose legs had been cut off fell to the ground, they let out heart-wrenching cries. The invisible line was not at the end of its flight. In fact, it was still advancing rapidly. However, the Baimang cavalry behind it, especially the Black Fox Lanzi, sensed that something was wrong and leaped up high, abandoning their horses and drawing their swords. There were even knights who suddenly pulled the reins and jumped over the line that was cutting across. The knights at the back began to quickly deviate from a straight line and tried their best to make a large arc to evade the attack. Princess Hongyan asked excitedly, "Gang Chi?" The old Dragon King nodded. She asked again, "How long and wide is the limit?" The embroidered robed elder shifted his gaze to the rear of the cavalry and replied, "This blade is about 300 meters long and 6 meters wide. But that's all it took." She clicked her tongue and said, "Wouldn't it be very impressive on the battlefield?" The old man said calmly, "On a large battlefield, there are hidden death warriors like Spiderweb, who only target the experts of Jianghu. Moreover, there are also archers, foot crossbows and even catapults. If ordinary experts dared to play like this, they would be the first living target to die. Of course, this person in front of us is an exception. If he really wants to fight to the death like the Sword Emperor of Shishu, I'm afraid he would need a few top experts to pin him down. Taking a step back, when such an expert's chi is exhausted to the point of exhaustion, he can still leave whenever he wants. No one can stop him. After all, it's just a matter of taking a breath. With such a breath, unless one is also an expert in martial arts, one would not be able to seize this fleeting opportunity. However, everything in this world has its vanquisher. If this person dares to charge into the enemy's formation, our god of war would naturally not mind taking his head personally. Most of the people who are a match for 10,000 men in the army are short-lived. After proving that they have the strength, they die. Princess Hongyan nodded in agreement and said, "This is also the reason why the experts of Jianghu are unwilling to participate in the killing on the battlefield. It's too depressing to die just like that. If they reincarnate in their next life, it's hard to guarantee that they will be reincarnated into a good body." That person seemed to raise his arm and lightly swiped the blade a few times. 6 or 7 black fox lanzi on the road who jumped off their horses exploded into pieces in the air. Following his backhanded blade movements, the range of his movements was extremely small. A warhorse that had jumped high in the air had yet to step on the ground when an invisible line ran from the left side of the horse's abdomen to the right shoulder of the rider on the horse's back. It was cut into 2 halves. Another large splash of blood spilled onto the ground. A rider who was drawing his bow and shooting an arrow had his head split apart along with his horse's head. Between the swordsman and the 300 riders, there was already a large pool of blood. Then this pool of blood continued to move forward rapidly as the swordsman continued to raise his hand. These armored riders were easily cut apart like tofu by the blade. Princess Hongyan said with a face full of regret, "They're just ants." The old Dragon King, who had no sympathy for this tragedy, said calmly, "It's true that they're ants. However, the reason why it's so miserable is because there are too few of them. As long as the ants gather into an uncountable number of ants, then not only the West Shu Sword Emperor will be bitten to death." The old man continued, "There are masters in Bailiang who can single-handedly decide the battle of 10,000 men. However, there are only a few of them. This one Yuan Zhuozong and Su Yanbing. Yuan Zhuozong was the commander of the cavalry. When the situation reached a critical point where he had to save the situation, it meant that the entire northern Liang border army was almost finished. That spear Immortal Wang Xiu's junior apprentice brother is most likely to appear in the early stages of the battle. No one would be willing to leave such a sharp spear in the armory without drinking blood." Princess Hongyan nodded. "That's right. If it's his turn, the king of Bailiang has to go to the battlefield to kill the enemy. Not to mention the Bailiang frontier army. I'm afraid that the 4 states of Bailiang will be ours." She suddenly laughed happily. "Old Dragon King, he's temporarily holding the title of #1 in the world. However, no matter how powerful he is, he can only watch the 300,000 soldiers of the Su family die one by one. Does he feel helpless?" The old man thought for a while and laughed. "If I were him, I would have run away long ago. The world is vast. Where can't I go? Where can't I be free?" Chapter 1260. She asked curiously, "Since killing at the border is the same, why doesn't this person just sneak into our palace and start a massacre? Isn't it quite good at disturbing the morale of the army?" The old Dragon King didn't know whether to laugh or cry at her naive thoughts. He sighed and said, "After reaching the celestial state, it's easy for experts to sense each other. Even if he can kill 1 or 2 cities, even if the entire Aquarius state bleeds for thousands of miles, then what? Would he be besieged and killed by masters like Tuoba Hongjingyan and Jian Qianjin?" Princess Hongyan curled her lips and said, "Why are you still so restrained after becoming an invincible expert? How boring. In the past, I've only heard that the half-saints of the celestial state of Confucianism, Buddhism and Taoism didn't dare to kill easily because they were afraid of being tainted by karma. It turns out that these pure martial artists aren't much better." The old man's face was bitter and he said some words of conscience. "I have no choice but to wait for death here with you, princess. Isn't that even more boring?" The old man looked at the sky for no reason and sighed. "Between the heavens and the earth, with the heavens and the earth, who isn't a puppet with their hands and feet tied? There are people who are lucky enough to jump out of this cage, but there's definitely no one who can break it." Princess Hongyan was surprised. "It's over? The thunder is loud but the rain is too light. I haven't had enough fun watching it." While they were talking, the knight of Beimang didn't disappoint this noble surnamed Yelu. When the less than 300 riders all stopped their horses, that person also stopped his blade. A famous archer in the Lu battalion seized this perfect opportunity to draw his bow into a full moon. The bowstring released a loud bang and shot an arrow at the young swordsman. The other two burly knights with big bows on their backs followed suit. They didn't need to deliberately prepare their arrows. Instead they drew their bows and shot out an arrow in one go. 3 sharp arrows pierced through the air, the arrowheads all aimed accurately at the swordsman's face. What happened next left these seasoned elites flabbergasted. The 3 arrows hovered quietly in the air, maintaining their slanting postures. The saberman sheathed the cold saber that the Baimang border army hated the most. 1 eagle feather arrow and 2 ordinary feather arrows. He reached out to grab the eagle plume arrow, which was known in the Central Plains as faster than a hawk and unable to be shaken by a strong wind, and threw it out with a backhand. The archer, who had subconsciously grabbed the reins after shooting the arrow, had his head pierced through by the arrow. His entire body was pulled back by the huge force. His hands pulled the reins and the warhorse raised its front hooves. The knight's corpse fell off the horse. The warhorse that had been with the dead knight day and night still seemed to be in a daze. It stepped lightly on its fine hooves, turned around, and used its nose to touch its master who had fallen to the ground. A black fox that looked like a leader turned around and looked at the northern sky with great nostalgia. After turning his head again, he faced the young expert with terrifying strength. This Lanzi suddenly squeezed his horse's belly and took the lead in a crazy charge that was tantamount to suicide. The second warhorse began to follow, then the third, the fourth. In the end, none of the riders in the entire cavalry turned around and retreated. All of them began to charge. Seeing this tragic scene, Princess Hongyan bit her lip and said softly, "Let's go." The old man was puzzled, but he did not hesitate. He grabbed her shoulder and retreated. She closed her eyes and felt the strong wind blow past her ears. She said, "If we allow the news of them dying here for no reason to spread back to the grasslands, then their deaths will be in vain." The old Dragon King did not say anything. Nearly 400 riders had chased down 14 riders, but they had not succeeded. If they allowed the enemy crossbowmen to send back information, even if these Baimang warriors had all died in battle, their parents, wives, children, and even their entire tribes on the grasslands would be implicated. And these people were originally waiting for their families to return home with military merits and food. Even if they returned empty-handed, it was good that they were alive. After allowing the 2 big fish to leave, Su Fengyan helped the 14 crossbowmen cover the retreat. He hung the cold saber at his waist and faced the aggressive Baimang cavalry. He began to run. The leader of the Black Fox fence was the first to reach him. Su Fengyan jumped up. The leader was still in the posture of raising his arm and slashing his saber. He slapped the man's head with his palm. Both the man and his horse were smashed into the yellow sand. The warhorse's abdomen was stuck to the sand pit. However, Su Fengyan had a head in his hand. He pulled it out and threw it at the second Black Fox fence. The fence's chest was blown apart. Su Fengyan quickly fell to the ground. With a shake, his shoulders hit the sides of the warhorses on both sides. The horse's hooves left the ground and the 2 riders fell to the side. One of the riders charged forward fiercely. However, when it was about 10 feet away from Su Fengyan, the rider and the horse were crushed by the majestic qi, bursting into a cloud of bloody mist. The spiderweb spy hidden between the Black Fox fence and the elite Lu cavalry broke through the bloody mist without warning. The tip of his sword pointed directly at Su Fengyan's forehead. Su Fengyan completely ignored the tip of the sword. He stretched out his hand and pressed down on the head of the spy. Then he slammed the spy to the ground. The tip of the sword shattered and the blade snapped. The spy's body bounced on the yellow sand. First, blood flowed out of his 7 orifices. Then his meridians were broken and blood seeped out of his entire body. This corpse was kicked up by Su Fengyan and slammed into a warhorse in front of him. After the dozen or so riders at the front died without any resistance, the surviving riders finally lost the courage to charge to their deaths. Some people began to retreat. There were hot-blooded people in the world who were not afraid of death. There were also people who were afraid of death but could calmly die for it. However, these brave and skilled Baimang elites did not wish to die at the hands of an enemy whose name and identity they did not even know. Su Fengyan stamped his foot slightly and stretched out a hand. On the ground in front of him, yellow sand swords rose from the ground. After about half an incense stick's worth of time, the old man in embroidered clothes, who had brought Princess Hongyan and dashed for more than 20 li, straightened his back in an instant. A cold voice rang out from behind him. "The two of you are old acquaintances I met at Tumbling Horse Pass. Do you not value your lives at all?" Then Princess Hongyan realized that her buttocks were lightly patted. The person behind her smiled and said, "The old debt is settled. So you can die now." Chapter 1261. There are still 2 chapters left, but it's definitely late, especially the 3rd chapter. Every dog has its day. At the Tumbling Horse Pass, the old Dragon King escorted the woman with a mink headscarf into the dangerous northern Liang border pass. She saw the young man with a pair of beautiful eyes and thought that he was just a disciple of an aristocratic family who knew a little about martial arts. She wanted to tease him, so she did as she pleased and touched his buttocks. Who would have thought that the tables would turn so quickly? Today, after he patted her buttocks, the princess, the only descendant of the royal family who could make the Empress of Beimang willing to play with her grandson, did not even have the courage to turn around. The old man in embroidered clothes was indeed the ancestor of Beimang's spider web. He gently pushed Princess Hongyan's shoulder and pushed her far away. Her life was hanging by a thread, so she did not care about controlling her strength and fell into the yellow sand more than 10 feet away. After sending her out of danger temporarily, the old Dragon King let out a light shout. His voice was like spring thunder and his chi flowed like a flood. Thousands of tiny cracks appeared on his luxurious brocade clothes that were not inferior to those made in Jiangnan. The old Dragon King did not turn around. He did not even turn his head. He raised his arm and smashed backward. The sleeves on his arm instantly turned into fine powder. Dragon King Hulu Tieguan was an expert who had been famous in northern Mang for a long time. Before Tuoba Bodhisattva, Murong Baoding Hongjingyan, and the other new talents had risen to prominence, the heaven-warping Hulu Tieguan was once viewed as a peak expert who could block spear Immortal Wang Xiu's spear with his bare hands. Hulu Tieguan's close-quarters combat skills couldn't be said to be weak, especially his tenacious muscles and bones. Before Murong Baoding obtained the great reputation of immovable wisdom king, he had even asked Hulu Tieguan for guidance on body-tempering secret techniques. When the Empress of Beimang was purging the Jianghu forces, Hulu Tieguan, who was summoned, showed off his skills. 8 siege chariots with 200 strong men each threw 8 stones weighing 180 pounds at the same time towards the Dragon King Hulu Tieguan, who was standing 2,000 feet away. The old man smashed the stones with his fist in the air and did not let any of the stones fall to the ground. The old but vigorous Hulu Tieguan's arms swung out like wind and thunder. Su Fengnian stretched out his right hand and casually grabbed the old Dragon King's wrist. He snapped his fingers and broke Chongsheng. Hulu Tieguan instantly felt that the rapidly flowing qi in his body was cut off, like a fast ship suddenly encountering a chain across the river. Moreover, this chain was not only in one place but in 6 important acupoints of his body, as if it had forcibly set up 6 barriers in his body. Even if you are a fine horse that can travel 1,000 li in a day under the heavy snow, you will not be able to move forward. Hulu Tieguan was trembling all over. Blood spurted out from the gaps between his teeth. Even if he was injured, he still wanted to break through those iron chains. He tried his best to connect all the meridians in his body. The old Dragon King was very decisive and ruthless. However, since Su Fengnian had made a move, he would not hesitate. He raised his left hand like a knife and placed it on Hulu Tieguan's shoulder and ear. Then he slapped his left hand and grabbed the old man's wrist. Hulu Tieguan's head was violently shaken. What was even more shocking was that the old man's entire arm was pulled out from his body by Su Fengnian. At the same time, the right side of Hulu Tieguan's head was densely covered in bright red threads. They were like countless red snakes wantonly swimming in his skin. Hulu Tieguan's strong points were his extraordinary strength, dragon tendons and iron bones. He was incomparably proficient in close combat. However, he definitely did not know that if he let Su Fengnian get close to him and tremble, it would be tantamount to letting the Liang dynasty's Han Wudi, who was known as the Land Immortal, get close to him. And the only person in the world who was proficient in killing celestial state experts, Han Xianxia, should be able to kill a finger celestial state expert. Hulu Tieguan, whose arm had been torn off, had his feet deeply sunk into the sand. His eyes were wide open as he stared into the distance, not moving at all. Su Fengnian gently let go of the arm and turned around to look at the insufferably arrogant woman with the marten forehead. This sorrowful Princess Hongyan was sitting on the ground in a daze. She did not know why the old Dragon King, who was rarely matched in her mind, was motionless. She only knew that the old man was definitely seriously injured. She would never have thought that the legendary figure of Beimeng Hulu Taiguan had already breathed his last. Su Fengnian looked at this woman who had probably forgotten to run away. Neither of them spoke. She suddenly shouted in a stern voice, "Old Dragon King, kill him. He's the king of Bailiang, Su Fengnian. As long as you kill him, I'll personally go to His Majesty and ask for your reward. You can be a great general and be the prefect of discipline." Princess Hongyan was not stupid. On the contrary, she was an extremely intelligent and shrewd woman. Otherwise, she would not have been able to deal with the two surnames, Yelu and Murong. She cried out, "Hulu Taiguan, why don't you make a move?" With a face full of tears, she choked out, "Old Dragon King, at least move a little bit." Su Fengnian looked at this woman's marten forehead, but his left hand was already on the cold saber at his waist. Princess Hongyan suddenly calmed down. She stood up and patted off the yellow sand and dust on her dress. She tidied up her messy black hair and the slanted sable scarf on her forehead. She slowly asked, "Can I choose a way to die that isn't ugly?" Chapter 1262. Su Fengnian did not answer this question. Instead, he smiled and said, "Do you have anything that can be exchanged for your life? For example, the movements of Dong Zhuo and Lu Gui's armies? Or do you have any news about the orphans of Yelu de Tong? Or else you can talk about the two large camps of heavy cavalry in Beimeng." The corners of her mouth twitched. She did not hide her sarcasm at all. Su Fengnian's thumb gently pushed the knife out of its sheath. At this moment, a rider galloped over. On the back of the horse was a young rider whose face was covered in blood. He even had an extra horse with him. Looking at his attire and accessories, it was neither fish nor fowl. He had the armor and saber of the Lu Centurion, as well as the unique short saber of Black Fox Lang. On his back was a huge bow with carved feathers. It was likely that this rider had made a fortune from the dead. Princess Hongyan turned her head to look at the rider who had just survived a disaster. Her eyes were full of disdain and hatred. She did not need to think to know that this was a traitor. On the Beimeng grasslands, this kind of man had the lightest bones. The young rider who had relied on horsemanship and archery to enter the personal cavalry of the Lu general stopped his horse and panted heavily. He also looked at the woman with the mink hair covering her forehead. Previously, in the army camp, he had only seen her a few times from a distance. At that time, one of the generals had respectfully led her and her entourage to the general's tent. He did not even dare to think that he would be able to talk to this kind of rich and noble woman in his lifetime. As for the disdain in her eyes at this moment, this young man who had indeed defected couldn't help but lower his eyelids. However, he quickly raised his head. He did not look at the woman who made people feel ashamed of their inferiority. Instead, he looked at the slender back of the swordsman. His body began to tremble uncontrollably. The previous scene was still vivid in his mind. Including him, the 300 riders began to retreat and flee. This swordsman of similar age had cast sand flying swords out of thin air. When he turned around, he saw with his own eyes that the swords had pierced through the backs of his fellow soldiers. Occasionally, a knight would use his scimitar to shatter the flying swords, but he could not stop the second flying sword from piercing through his chest. A comrade was pierced through his shoulder by a flying sword and fell off his horse. His entire body was nailed into the sand. While the man was chasing after the comrade, he casually stretched out his hand and pressed down. The injured comrade who was struggling for his life a few feet away sank into the ground, stirring up a cloud of yellow sand. Then he disappeared without a sound. After one of the Black Fox Lanzi fell off his horse, his entire chest was pierced by a flying sword. He staggered as he charged towards this person, but this person brushed past him. The Black Fox Lanzi's legs left the ground, and his head seemed to have been hit by a heavy hammer. He leaned back and fell heavily to the ground. A centurion of the personal guards of the Lu army was lying on the ground, barely breathing. That person used the cold blade in his hand, which had yet to be unsheathed, to knock lightly on his head. Just like that, his entire head exploded. When that person got closer and closer to him as if possessed, he no longer urged his horse to run wildly. Instead, he turned his horse around and blocked the path. However, he did not go to his death. Instead, he waited for death. He did not know what he was doing. He only watched as that person continuously controlled the flying sword to kill people. If there was someone next to him who had not yet breathed their last, he would use the cold blade in his scabbard or a newly forged flying sword to finish them off expressionlessly. At that moment, in the eyes of this little pawn who was in a state of death, the entire sky was like a swarm of flying swords. Then these flying swords wove together into a vast net. There were 6 or 7 black fox lanzi who were fighting like trapped beasts. They passed by the dazed pawn, roaring as they charged towards that person. Then both the riders and their horses were carried into the sky by the flying swords with astonishing penetrative power. In the end they fell to the ground together. In his eyes for a few moments he seemed to see that person breathing in and out. One breath was as fine as a drop of water. One breath was like a gently trembling lotus leaf. One breath was like a whale swallowing heaven and earth. For some reason that person brushed past him but did not kill him. When he was the only one left alive among the 300 riders, that person appeared by his side. Using fluent Baimang language he ordered him to pick any armor, swords and arrows he wanted. Then he asked him to bring an extra warhorse and leave with him. Probably because he felt that he had already died once, the young rider at that time had forgotten his fear. After returning from the gates of hell, he still had the mood to pick up those good items that he had long been envious of. He changed into a good horse, put on armor, equipped himself with a war blade and carried a large bow on his back. Not a single item was left behind. The young man even changed into a new pair of sturdy leather boots for himself. The wind swept up the yellow sand. The only ones left alive were these 3 people and 2 horses. Princess Hongyan looked at Su Fengnian. She pointed at the young rider and said through gritted teeth, "You killed him." Su Fengnian used a gaze that looked like he was sizing up a madman. He looked mischievously at this most noble woman of the imperial family in the desert. "He's worth much more than you." Su Fengnian continued, "He won't die. But I'll give you one last chance. As long as you can take out something valuable enough to buy your life, I'll promise not to kill you." Princess Hongyan screamed crazily, "Kill him. This kind of person doesn't deserve to be a Baimang man." Su Fengnian raised his arm and made a cold gesture of chopping at the young rider. The rider steadied his breathing and began to charge forward with his blade without hesitation. Princess Hongyan was completely dumbfounded. She could allow herself to die at the hands of the king of Bailiang. But she would never allow herself, a princess of Baimang, the only daughter of the Yushan province's provincial magistrate, who was deeply doted on by the empress, to die under the blade of a grassland trader. Moreover, this nameless coward was so despicable. She smiled bitterly and looked at Su Fengnian with hatred. Then she quickly pulled out a dagger and stabbed it toward her own heart. Chapter 1263. The sun was setting in the west, and the 2 riders were riding slowly on a flat sandy land commonly known as Longan. 30 miles to the south was Hutu City, the most majestic city in Bailiang's border. There were 30,000 elite soldiers, 3,000 heavy cavalry, 6,000 light cavalry, and more than 20,000 infantry inside and outside the city. Even if the people in the city were not listed as soldiers, as long as they were in the prime of their lives, they could put on armor and fight on horseback in a hurry. Behind Hutu City was the newly established Huaiyang Pass of the Protectorate of Northern Liang. To the left and right of Huaiyang Pass were the 2 great pass cities of Liuya and Taifeling, both of which had more than 10,000 soldiers. Unlike Hutu City, which had an absolute advantage in terms of infantry, Liuya and Taifeling were almost entirely composed of cavalrymen in light armor. Clearly, they were different from Hutu City, which was mainly used to stop the northern Mang's army from advancing south. These 2 border cities, which were slightly inferior in scale, were more responsible for taking the initiative to attack. Behind the first line of defense was the second line of defense, with Jinyuan, Qinghe and Grave as the fulcrum, and Xianken and Xinwu as the flanks in the north of Liangzhou, followed by the Great Snow Dragon Cavalry, which was stationed at the border of Liangzhou all year round, and the 2 deputy commanders of infantry and cavalry, Qin Yunque and He Zhonghu's army. Coupled with the crisscrossing watchtowers of Wubao Castle, there was no doubt that the northern border of Liangzhou was the most difficult battlefield in Bailiang. Generally speaking, Baimang was the least likely to attack the heavily guarded northern line of Liangzhou. If the northern barbarians really wanted to open their mouths and take over this place, it would not be as simple as breaking teeth and swallowing blood. Compared to northern Liang's Liangzhou's northern line, Yozhou's side was mostly infantrymen. That was why infantry great commander Yan Wenluan's tent was also located there. Regardless of whether it was the terrain of Yozhou's northern line or the distribution of troops, it all decided that Yuzhou would be a typical offensive and defensive battle between the nomads of the north and the farmers of the central plains, one side attacking, one side defending. It wasn't like northern Liang's northern line where they relied on Su family's armored cavalry to fight northern Mang's cavalry on horseback. Originally, the dragon elephant cavalry was stationed in the middle of Liangzhou and Liangzhou, so they could support both sides at any time and even roam around looking for opportunities. However, with the establishment of the 4th province, Liuzhou, and the 30,000 Long Xiang army stationed there, a crack appeared in the close relationship between Liangzhou and Liangzhou. The number one city in the northwest of the Liang dynasty wasn't the provincial capital of the northern Liang, Liangling and Nether provinces, but rather this tiger-head city that appeared out of nowhere and looked down on northern Mang. On the border of Liangzhou, there were some passes like Tuma Pass for merchants to enter and leave Liangmang, but to the north of Liangzhou there was none. This place was destined to be filled with smoke signals and 100 battles, but never the sound of the camel bells of the caravans. Although there were only 2 riders, one of them was dragging a wretched woman whose hands were tied up. She was covered in dust, her lips were dry and cracked, and the pair of delicate embroidered shoes on her feet, which looked like those of a graceful girl from Jiangnan, were also in tatters, revealing her bloody toes. Her body was on the verge of collapse, but she was still holding on. When she was able to raise her head and look into the distance towards Tiger Head City that was rumored to be most fond of displaying the heads of northern Mang captives, because of this untimely pause, she was dragged to the ground by the warhorse. That horseman didn't turn around. She struggled with all her might to get up, or else she would be dragged towards Tiger Head City like this. However, she was already too exhausted to stand up, only able to turn around. A wave of scorching pain came from her back as she slid across the gravel. This type of pain didn't come from how great the pain was in an instant, but rather from the endless, bit-by-bit accumulation. That Beimang rider who was following orders couldn't help but turn his head to shoot a glance. This woman who was sitting high up in the clouds fell off the altar just like that, and in the end was dragged forward by him and his mount like a dog. He turned his head to look at the rider in front of him. He didn't know why this person didn't kill him, and he also didn't know why he didn't kill her. In the distance there was a commotion. A group of several hundred riders with a majestic aura shook the earth as they approached. His heart contracted violently. This was the first time in his life that he had seen such a large number of Bailiang cavalry. He also quickly discovered that the Bailiang cavalry was different from the Lu cavalry he used to be in. The Lu cavalry was undoubtedly brave and ruthless when they broke through enemy lines and killed the enemy. After he joined the army he was also like this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to become one of General Lu Gui's personal guards. However, the feeling these northern Liang cavalry gave him was even more frightening. Previously, when he fought with the crossbowmen, it wasn't that obvious. He only felt that those well-known northern Liang crossbowmen's strength was indeed astonishing. However, when their numbers exceeded 300, it gave him an extremely strange feeling, as if these 300 to 400 cavalry were a single entity. When they urged their horses and brandished their whips, it was filled with a type of forbearance and restraint that would make all of the northern Mang's brave warriors feel extremely uncomfortable. The Hutu city garrison in front of him even had the same degree of movement every time their bodies rose and fell along with the backs of their horses. He had only heard that the 2 large groups of heavy cavalry that had been raised with countless amounts of gold and silver could truly advance side by side when they were completely spread out in formation to charge in a single line. These 400 riders dismounted almost at the same time. The leading middle-aged rider knelt on one knee. He lowered his head and cupped his fists. General Lu Jinu pays his respects to the prince. Then the 400 riders said in unison, "Respects to the prince." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Rise all of you. This time I've troubled General Lu to come out of the city to welcome me." The young captive behind Su Fengyan who could still ride a horse and put on armor was stunned for a moment. He couldn't quite wrap his head around it. However, when he saw General Lu, who was wearing armor and carrying a crossbow and looked exactly like the rider behind him, stand up, he seemed to be a cripple. Chapter 1264. Then he knew who this plain-looking lame general was. He was Bailiang's #1 border general, Hutu City's guard general Lame Lu. He didn't know who Lu Jinu was, but almost every soldier with the surname Lu had heard of this legendary Lame Lu in the desert. This person was different from Beimang's valiant generals, who were cursed at in Beimang the more they performed. Lame Lu was recognized as a great general in the world by the scholars of Beimang's southern dynasty. He governed the army strictly, but outside of the battlefield he treated the soldiers like his own children. He had 2 sons and 2 daughters. His sons had died at the border, and his youngest son had died at the age of 16. Both of his daughters had married his subordinates and both of them had become widows. Lame Lu was never merciful to his enemies, but he never killed the innocent. 14 years ago, during a long-distance revenge raid, he went deep into the heart of Gusai province and beheaded tens of thousands of people along the way. His leg had been pierced by a captive woman with a dagger, but Lame Lu still didn't kill her. He only left behind a sentence that no one knew whether it was true or false, but was widely spread on the grasslands. No matter if it's our Baoyang or your Beimang, only when all the men are dead will it be your women's turn. Lu Jinu accompanied Su Fengyan to the majestic Tiger Head city. More than half of his life was spent there. Looking at the tall city walls, the eyes of this military general who had achieved great feats on the battlefield were unusually warm. The 400 elite riders behind them slowly turned their horses around and returned. They couldn't help but glance at the 2 strange people. The young man riding the horse was dressed in northern barbarian attire and carried a lot of weapons. He was dragging a woman with a mink forehead who could only walk pitifully. After entering the city, Su Fengyan took a bath and changed his clothes. Lu Jinu and a few Hutu city captains stood respectfully at the steps of the outer courtyard. The last time Su Fengyan patrolled the border as the new Prince Liang, he stopped at Huayang Pass and didn't come here. It was said that the captains at that time complained that this prince looked down on their Hutu city and treated the soldiers of Hutu city as the children of Baoyang's stepmother. The captain who led the 3,000 heavy cavalry openly declared that if he had the ability, he would let the cowardly garrison at Huayang Pass practice martial arts with him. He didn't want to bully the cavalry of Huayang Pass because they were light cavalry. At worst he could borrow another 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers from them. He could still beat those guys without 3 rounds of charge. Su Fengyan saw a strong man who pretended to be calm but was obviously a little restrained. He waved his hand and motioned for the pillars of Hutu city to sit down and talk. With Lu Jinu's experience and military achievements he could talk calmly with the old Prince Liang. Of course he wouldn't be at a loss when facing Su Fengyan, the new prince of Baoyang. He calmly sat on the stone bench. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Ma Jili, who had scolded him the most after drinking, move the stone bench and sit at the back like a shy little girl who didn't dare to see her lover. Su Fengyan tilted his head as if he was looking for someone. He deliberately asked with a smile, "General Lu is Captain Ma who said that even if he can't beat me in martial arts he can drink me down?" Lu Jinu held back his laughter and didn't speak. The captains, who were as rough as the sandstorm in the frontier fortress, couldn't help but laugh out loud. Their laughter was full of straightforward kindness. No matter how feminine a man was, he would probably be hardened by the scorching sun here year after year. No matter how narrow-minded a man was, he would probably be bullied by the vast sky here day after day. Ma Jili straightened his back and stuck his head out from behind his comrade's back. Reporting to Wang Ye, he said, "Lowly officer is here. Few senior are really angry and want lowly officer to eat a whip. Lowly officer will have no objection. But when I'm being whipped, can you find a place where my subordinates can't see? Otherwise I'll be laughed at by those guys." Su Fengyan obviously didn't want to bicker with this man. He asked, "General Lu, can everyone drink?" Lu Jinu nodded and joked, "Of course, everyone can drink. That's how it is when these people fight. When it comes to drinking, everyone is number one. However, Ma Jili and Chu Hanqing both have to be on night patrol. As long as the others don't get too drunk, it's fine." Su Fengyan grunted, "Then let's stop drinking. We can only make up for what we owe in the future." Lu Jinu turned his head and shouted, "Ma Jili, go with Chu Hanqing and bring 2 jars of wine here. Then go on night patrol." Ma Jili was relieved. He ran out of the courtyard with another captain and quickly returned with 2 jars of green ant wine. Feeling guilty, Ma Jili didn't dare to stay any longer. He wanted to run away quickly. Chu Hanqing, the elegant captain of Hutu city, hesitated for a moment. He looked at Su Fengyan and asked, "Your Highness, I can't drink tonight. I don't know when and where I can drink next time. Can I use an empty bowl to offer a toast to your highness? Su Fengnian nodded. Chu Hanqing raised the empty bowl high. Su Fengnian stood up and drank the green ant wine in one gulp. Ma Jili asked nervously, Your Highness, how about I also offer you a toast? Su Fengnian smiled and drank another bowl. Su Fengnian sat back down on the stone bench. He looked at the border officers who all had sincere smiles on their faces and asked, General Lu, is there anything else Hutu City needs? Feel free to ask. Lu Jinu held the bowl in one hand and rested the other on his lame leg. He shook his head with a smile and said, There's nothing else. Su Fengnian didn't say anything else. He drank silently with these old generals of northern Liang who were already over 40 years old. In the end, Lu Jinu only said one sentence, Since your highness is sitting here, then I can say something that I thought I couldn't say. Hutu City has more than 40,000 people. Today they've all drunk your highness farewell wine. Even if they die they have no regrets. Chapter 1265. When Lu Jinu and the other generals left the courtyard, Su Fengnian had the guards outside call for the two captives. Elsewhere, Commandery Princess Hongyan was wolfing down food. When she reluctantly walked into the courtyard, her clothes were still ragged, but her mouth was greasy. When she crossed the threshold she even burped. This made the Lu cavalry soldier beside her, who was still wearing his armor and carrying his saber and bow, feel curious. He probably realized that a woman like her was not truly otherworldly after all. There was still half a jar of green ant wine left on the table. Clearly Lu Jinu and the others had shown mercy. Su Fengnian picked up the wine bowl and pointed at a few stone stools. Commandery Princess Hongyan sat down. The young cavalry soldier, who respected Su Fengnian more and more like a god, still stood obediently. Commandery Princess Hongyan glanced at the wine jar and bowl on the table and subconsciously sniffed. She was not afraid of itching when she had so many lice, so she poured herself a bowl of wine. She had tasted green ant wine at Falling Horse Pass and even in the imperial court and the capital. She did not think it tasted that good before, but today the wine burned from the tip of her tongue to her throat and then to her stomach. Her entire body instantly warmed up. She felt warm and full. At the same time she looked at Su Fengnian with more provocation. She knew that Su Fengnian did not let her commit suicide, so it would be harder for her to die than to live. Of course this was not necessarily a good thing. Before entering Tiger Head City, she had thought of countless sinister ways Su Fengnian could humiliate her as Commandery Princess Hongyan. However, looking at the current situation, while the situation was indeed terrible, it was still within her acceptable range. She raised her head and drank the wine in the bowl in one big gulp. Wiping the corner of her mouth, she said with a charming smile, What? Does your highness want me to serve you in bed? Then why don't you let me change into a clean set of clothes? Su Fengnian asked in return, Do you need me to send you a mirror so you can look at yourself? Princess Hongyan flew into a rage out of humiliation. Just as she was about to raise her hand to throw the wine bowl away, she quickly suppressed this impulse. She silently poured another bowl of wine. Every bowl she could get was a bowl. Su Fengnian ignored the featherless phoenix. He turned his head to look at the rider who called himself Chifu Longguan and said, You are very talented in martial arts. That is why I did not kill you. There was another reason that Su Fengnian did not mention. From the eyes of the dragon crown, one could not see the hatred that even an outsider like Princess Hongyan would have. Even if a person could hide their expression and eyes, the flow of their qi could not be hidden from Su Fengnian's eyes. The fluctuation of qi was directly related to happiness, anger, sorrow, and joy. This meant that Chifu Longguan, this unpolished jade that had been buried, might be able to go very far on the path of martial arts. Of course, the most important reason was that Su Fengnian hoped that there would be someone who could balance his disciple Yudilong in the future. This child was the youngest but was the eldest disciple. Unlike Wang Xing and Lu Yunzhang, whose personalities were clear, there were too many uncertainties. Su Fengnian did not want to have another Xianyuan pan in his hands in the future. As for Chifu Longguan, he was like a random cat or dog picked up from the side of the road. His talent in martial arts was not the best that Su Fengnian had seen, but he was the most interesting. For example, Jiang and I and the charcoal girl of the Guanyin sect were called sword embryos. For example, Hong Shixiang and Zhao Ningxian of Longhu Mountain were the reincarnations of enlightened masters and were called Bodhi seeds. The Buddhist sect also had the concept of reincarnated spiritual children. As for Chifu Longguan, he was a little different. He had a bit of everything and nothing was pure. But this was precisely the case. He was most in line with Su Fengnian's martial arts journey. Moreover, in that battle Chifu Longguan had truly caught the thin line between the breaths of Su Fengnian, this celestial being. In the present world there were less than a handful of such people, and this nameless soldier was one of them. Chifu Longguan was only 18 years old, but he was already one of Lu Gui's personal cavalry. One had to know that the number one saber user, Gu Jiantang, might not even be as good as Chifu Longguan at this age. Of course, Su Fengnian was even more so back then. Chifu Longguan was a bit nervous. He said in a trembling voice, "King of Beiliang, this lowly one has been an orphan since young. I'll go wherever there's food to eat. If your highness doesn't trust this lowly one, you can let this lowly one join the Beiliang frontier army. Even a foot soldier is fine. I won't hesitate to kill Beimang." At this time Princess Hongyan laughed sinisterly and fanned the flames. "Orphan? Maybe your parents died under the hoofs of the Beiliang cavalry? It's never too late for a gentleman to take revenge." Chifu Longguan was not as shrewd as her, but he was no fool. He couldn't hold back and cursed, "Bitch. Bullshit your mother." The young man said with red eyes, "My parents were beaten to death by you rich and powerful bastards from the Southern Dynasty." Princess Hongyan was furious. The Southern Dynasty? What is the Southern Dynasty? The entire Southern Dynasty is just a watchdog raised by the Yelu family. I am Yelu Hongkai, a lowly person like you who can't even walk within 100 steps of me. Chifu Longguan's breathing was rapid, his chest heaving up and down. He took a big step forward and slapped this woman. Princess Hongyan was not a blockhead. She lowered her head and retreated, hiding behind Su Fengnian like a wisp of smoke. She chattered with a smug expression, "Hey, you can't hit me. Look at you, you deserve to never be able to avenge your parents. Oh, maybe trash like you was in the army and worked for the Southern Dynasty. Maybe you worked for those enemies." Chifu Longguan suddenly calmed down and stared at this woman. Princess Hongyan felt a bone-deep chill. She carefully took back the wine bowl and poured herself another bowl of green ant wine. At this time there was a light knock on the door. Su Fengnian poured 2 bowls of wine and said softly, "Senior Teng, please come in." Chapter 1266. When the uninvited guest sat down, Su Fengnian passed her a bowl of wine. The other party did not stand on ceremony and drank a mouthful of wine. Her cheeks were slightly red. Yelu Hongkai looked at this tall lady curiously. Every move she made showed the bearing of a grandmaster. There was also a kind of heart-tugging free and easy style. Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "Senior, how did you know that I have arrived at Tiger Head City?" Tantai Pingjing said indifferently, "I heard from my master that the celestial beings look down on all living things in the world, just like how we look at the fireflies in the summer night. Most of the fireflies are fleeting, but there are always a few that are especially bright. At some point they are even as bright as the stars." Su Fengnian suddenly understood. It must have been because they had intercepted and killed the 400 cavalrymen earlier that the Qi Refinement Grandmaster, who was good at observing aura, caught some clues. Then she was just waiting for them near Tiger Head City. According to Tantai Pingjing, or to be precise, according to the explanation of this master of the sect, the top masters of the world were only the people of the world of the immortals in the clouds. However, for masters like Bodhisattva Tuoba and Chao Zhongqing, the fireflies they emitted were particularly eye-catching. Qi refinement warriors were mending the net of law on behalf of the heavens. Naturally, it would be easier for them to find this small group of experts. Su Fengnian asked, "Can it be said that when people seek Tao and attain Tao, they are using the light of a grain of rice to compete with the brightness of the moon?" Tantai Pingjing shook her head and said, "Master said that after cultivating Tao, it is nothing more than a drop of water in the sea. The water of the Yellow River comes from the sky? No, it comes from the sea. Therefore it flows into the sea and never returns?" Su Fengnian joked, "Your master's words are so sharp, so reasonable." Tantai Pingjing dismissed it with a smile as if she was a venerable. Su Fengnian stared at Princess Hongyan, who wanted to secretly pour a bowl of wine for herself. The latter retracted her hand resentfully. Su Fengnian pointed at the courtyard door. Chifu Longguan took the lead and left. Princess Hongyan waited for a moment and guessed that the brat had gone far away. Only then did she sneak over to the courtyard door and cross the threshold. In the end, a crisp and clear pa sound was heard. followed by Princess Hongyan's furious curses. Tantai Pingjing said softly, "Your Highness has a good eye." Su Fingyan was puzzled. "What do you mean?" She took a small sip of wine. "This man and woman are both people with good fortune. They are worthy of Prince's care." Su Fingyan sneered. "Luck?" Tantai Pingjing's expression didn't change. "If your luck is too good, then that is your destiny. If it were a normal person, would they be able to survive if they had an extra 100 lives when facing a martial arts expert who had started a massacre?" Su Fingyan was about to speak when Tantai Pingjing shook her head and said, "You have your reasons, but it doesn't change the fact that they survived." She continued, "According to our previous agreement, our Guanyin sect will stay south of Huayong Pass and north of Qinghe Pass. We will also do our best to gather good fortune for Bailiang. However, whether we stay or leave in the end is not up to the Bailiang Frontier Army to decide." Su Fingyan nodded. "Of course." She still asked bluntly, "What if your Highness unfortunately dies?" Su Fingyan said helplessly, "Don't worry. If that day really comes, I will give it all to that charcoal girl before I die." Tantai Pingjing hovered the wine bowl and asked seriously, "The war is imminent. Isn't it a bit unlucky for you to say this to me?" Su Fingyan smiled at the woman who seemed to be completely ignorant of worldly affairs and asked, "What do you think?" Tantai Pingjing rested one arm on the stone table and the other hand holding the wine bowl. She raised her head to look at the starry sky. Su Fingyan was in a peaceful mood. He closed his eyes and slowly took a sip of wine. The two people who didn't look at each other casually asked and answered each other's questions. The Baimang army's forces on the border are almost at their limit, but they still have spare soldiers and horses to launch the next wave of attacks on the northern grasslands. Faced with an enemy that the entire Liang dynasty should be able to contend against, aren't you worried about Liuzhou, which has the least danger? Of course I'm worried. It's probably like when Su Xiao watched me go to the Central Plains in Baimang. To attack Liuzhou, or Yuzhou, which one to attack first has its advantages and disadvantages for Baimang. What do you think? In truth, it doesn't matter where we attack first. My father, Su Xiao, my master, Li Yishan, Yuan Zuozong, Chu Lushan, Yan Wenluan, Qin Yunchue, He Zhonghu, and people like Lu Jinu of Hutu have already done the best they can for Bailiang. You might not believe it, but I'm beginning to think that Bailiang might really be able to hold on. But I don't know who will die on the battlefield in Bailiang. I don't want to know. Then why hasn't Tuoba appeared on the border? It's just like how the Zhao clan's Son of Heaven wants to keep Gu Jiantang in the north and not let him go to Guangling Road, because this is the dynasty's final trump card. When that old woman and the imperial tutor needed Tuoba to personally take action, it meant that the situation was starting to slip out of control. Before this, they were all confident that victory was in their grasp. Tantai Pingjing suddenly asked a very off-topic question, "Why didn't you kill that Baimang princess?" Su Fingyan laughed involuntarily. After a moment of silence, he looked at the starry sky with her. "Of course it's not that I like her. It's just that she reminds me of someone I miss very much. We both, like Martin forehead coverings, have the same bad reputation and have the same unyielding character. I could have killed her, but I didn't because I wanted her to know how difficult it is to live." Tantai Pingjing poured the last bit of wine into her bowl and finished it in one gulp. "Who do you really care about?" Su Fingyan stretched out his finger and pointed at the starry sky. He said gently, "My elder sister is there." After some time, Su Fingyan came back to his senses. He could not help but hold his forehead and sigh. This number 1 Qi refinement warrior of the dynasty, who had extraordinary status and strength, not only fell asleep drunk, but was also snoring on the table. Su Fingyan could read her mind. He looked at her and sighed. "You must be missing your master, right?" Chapter 1267. As the morning mist rose, a group of people rode out of Tiger Head City's south gate and parted ways. Chifu Longguan changed into the armor of the Bailiang Light Cavalry, and at the same time received a new identity card. His name was also changed to Chifu Longguan. From today onwards he was a member of the Bailiang Frontier Army. When he left the city, the young man who had betrayed Baimang would occasionally touch the cold saber at his waist. The Bailiang war saber was known as the Grand Su style, which meant that all war sabers in the world had to be made using the Su family's war saber. Chifu Longguan knew that if this war saber was sold in the royal court, it would be impossible to get it without 500 taels of silver. Moreover, there was a price but no market. Countless members of the royal family and the grassland were proud to be able to collect the complete set of Su Yongliang's saber. Chifu Longguan, who was used to being poor, had such a saber. His back straightened a bit and he always felt that he was now a rich man. But there was a secret that made the young rider even more excited than the cold saber light crossbow and his identity. The king of Bailiang had passed on to him a nameless saber manual and a set of Wudong mantras. Chifu Longguan was now full of pride, and he was also willing to fight on the battlefield for the young new king of Liang. He followed the king of Bailiang's orders to escort Princess Hongyan to Luzhou. As long as he threw this yellow woman to the border, he could ignore her. When the time came, he could directly join the Longxiang army. After that, whether he lived or died in the Battle of Liangmang would depend on his own luck. Yelu Hongkai hesitated, then turned his horse around and spurred it to catch up to Su Fengnian. He stopped his horse to block the way and said in a low voice, "You're just going to let me go back to Beimang like this?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "What else? Let the Jade Cicada Prefecture take out a mountain of gold and silver to redeem you? Even if your father is willing to pay, you are destined not to return alive." A proper princess captured by Bailiang as a captive, the Yelu family probably can't afford to lose face. Yelu Hongkai wanted to say something but stopped. Su Fengnian waved his hand and said, "Your life and death has no bearing on the big picture. Don't think too highly of yourself." Yelu Hongkai smiled playfully and said, "I originally wanted to reveal the whereabouts of the Beimang army, but since you don't want to listen to my calculations and guesses, then forget it." Su, Yelu Hongkai's eyes, Yelu Hongkai. The woman narrowed her eyes, her face as dark as water. She fiercely slammed her horsewhip and brushed past the repulsive fellow. Su Fengnian and Tantai Pingjing continued on their way to Huayang Pass. Seeing the questioning look of this Qi refinement grandmaster, Su Fengnian smiled softly and said, "Given Yelu Hongkai's scheming nature, I can't expect her to tell me the truth. She might even lie about the military situation to trick me once. Instead of being tormented by her words and becoming suspicious of everything, I might as well not listen." Yelu Hongkai smiled and said, "My intuition tells me that once this lady speaks, she will speak the truth." Su Fengnian mocked himself, "It sounds like we have suffered a great loss?" But he did not call back Princess Hongyan, who might be kind-hearted once in a while. Tantai Hongyan smiled and did not speak anymore. She was tall. Although she was 100 years old, her face was still youthful. She was dressed in snow-white clothes. When she galloped, her clothes fluttered in the wind, like a huge white lotus blooming on the desert. At this moment, this scene was worthy of being described as shocking. After a moment of silence, Tantai Hongkai suddenly asked curiously, "Beimang has a huge debate on whether to attack the Bailiang in the west or the Liang dynasty in the east. If not for the mysterious royal tutor from the chess and sword music school and the new king of the south courtyard, Dong Zhuo, who insisted on attacking the Bailiang first, you Bailiang would be the laughingstock of Gujiantang now. Apart from that, most of the Beimang generals and officials, as well as the most powerful factions in the grassland, felt that it was more worthwhile to attack the east. After all, if they defeated the two lines of defense, they would be able to force their way to Great Peace City. They might even be able to cooperate with West Chu's revival in Guangling Road. This would exhaust the Liang dynasty's army and make them unable to cooperate with each other. Why would the Empress of Beimang stand her ground against all opinions and agree to fight the Bailiang to the death? Isn't this exactly what the Empress of the Zhao family wanted? Besides, even if we take down Bailiang, we still have Qinjibao's western Shu as a buffer. Su Fengnian smiled and interrupted Tantai Hongkai's words. It's very simple. Beimang can attack Bailiang with all their strength, but they definitely won't dare to attack the Liang dynasty in the east. They don't dare to expose their butts to the 300,000 border soldiers of Bailiang. The Bailiang cavalry, who have experienced hundreds of battles, not only have unparalleled mobility, they are also very familiar with the desert terrain and long-distance raids. The northern Mang dared to send 200,000 soldiers to sit opposite Gujiantang, drink wine, eat meat, drink tea and admire the moon. If it was the northern Liang, they would have eaten until not even the bones were left. Then they would swagger in and the entire southern dynasty would suffer. It's not that the Taiping Commandery and Fatty Dong don't know what the Liang imperial court is planning, but they don't have a choice. If they don't take down Beiliang in one go and attack the eastern line that seems simple but is actually controlled by Zhang Julu, Gu Jiantang and Qin Jibao, Beimang would be wasting their national strength. And the most important thing is, Tantai Hongkai suddenly understood and nodded. I understand. As long as the Beiliang cavalry stays in the northwest, it means that even if the Liang dynasty loses the eastern line and even causes Great Peace City to be trapped, they still have enough initiative to change the stalemate. However, if Beimang successfully defeats Beiliang in one go, the initiative will switch to the Beimang Empress. In particular, if the Beiliang cavalry, known as the best in the world, is completely wiped out, no matter how much the people of the Central Plains dislike the Beiliang Su family, they have already lost half of their souls. If even Beiliang can't stop Beimang's iron hooves going south, then who can stop them? Su Fengnian sighed emotionally. Ever since Zhang Julu came to power, he didn't really support the military affairs of the northwest border, but he also didn't restrict them too much. This is also the strength of the Grand Secretary. It seems quiet and inactive, and there are suspicions that Beiliang is nurturing a tiger, but in reality he is helping the Zhao family win a day of sitting on the mountain and watching the tigers fight. Tantai Hongkai gazed at Great Peace City in the east and murmured, "The son of the Zhao family has already made a choice between home and country. Liang is committing suicide." Chapter 1268. Su Fengnian sneered. That's why the court is waiting for a good show to begin, but the biggest contributor behind the scenes won't be able to see this day. Isn't it because they're afraid that the new emperor won't be able to suppress the old Grand Secretary? They're afraid that too many poor carps will jump over the dragon's gate. When these wild carps enter the court and gradually band together, they'll all be barefooted guys who aren't afraid of wearing shoes. If they die, then they die. In any case, they'll be alone in the world, unlike the sons of wealthy families who still have to consider the interests of the huge families behind them. Even if more than half of these poor men are greedy for the feeling of wealth and honor, as long as 2 or 3 of them refuse to be controlled and dare to stiffen their necks to oppose the emperor, pleading for the people all day long, then it'll be enough for the emperor of the Zhao family to suffer. The next person to sit on the dragon throne, Zhao Xuan, doesn't have the military merit of the previous emperor unifying the Central Plains, nor does he have the current emperor's 20 years of experience of suppressing civil and military officials like Su Shao, Zhang Julu and Gu Jiantang. Zhao Xuan's father, if he doesn't do something before he dies, how can he be at ease handing over the entire world to Zhao Xuan? Therefore he painstakingly invited Qi Yonglong, who was already half in the yellow earth, to be the imperial tutor. By the time the old fellow stabilizes the situation in the court, he'll be about to die of old age. By that time Zhao Xuan will already be fully fledged. The vassal kings and generals will also have their military power stripped. In addition, he'll have the assistance of ministers like Yin Maochun, who don't have a deep enough foundation. He'll also be able to promote the sons and grandsons of wealthy families to keep the former in check. He won't have to be as diligent as the current emperor. He can just lie down comfortably and be the emperor. Sometimes when I think about that blue-eyed man, I really feel that it's not worth it for him. Tentai Pingjing sighed. Su Fengnian said self-mockingly, I just don't know if the Grand Secretary feels that it's not worth it for Beiliang. Tentai Pingjing smiled and asked, Is there resentment? Su Fengnian exhaled and said in a deep voice, My resentment is great. Tentai Pingjing said, It just so happens that Beimang bumped into the tip of Beiliang's blade. Su Fengnian looked at the sky. Perhaps this year's snow couldn't cover the blood. The headquarters of the Northern Liang Protectorate within Huayang Pass was still ridiculously simple and crude. This made the Huayang commandant Huang Laifu very nervous. Although he could not say that he was unable to eat or sleep in peace, every time he went to participate in the military affairs of the Protectorate General, he would always feel that this was not the case. A few of his close friends liked to use this matter to poke at him. Huang Laifu didn't even have a chance to talk back. He could only accept his fate. Over time he became the #1 joke in Liangzhou's northern border. But as the atmosphere of the impending war grew thicker and thicker, these harmless jokes quickly disappeared. Today Huang Laifu went to the Protector's manor to do official business. Recently, several generals and commanders were in the manor, discussing the deployment of Beimang's troops and the direction of the main attack. Huang Laifu was a rough man who knew how to fight but was not good at talking. He couldn't get a word in. But when he heard the arguments of the old generals and commanders he felt very comfortable. He felt that as long as they were in charge of the border, not to mention the fact that the Beiliang frontier army was strong and unharmed. Even if Hutu city was accidentally lost, Huang Laifu would take it back without a second thought. When Huang Laifu walked into the lobby of the Protector's Manor, which was hung with maps of various sizes, he obviously felt something strange. In the center of the lobby, there was a huge table made of yellow pear wood. On both sides of the table there were many new faces. Infantry Commander Yan Wenluan, an experienced general, should be visiting Huayang Pass for the first time. Cavalry Commander Yuan Zhuizong was also here. Great Ancestor Gu Zhoukong, He Zhonghu and Qin Yunchui, the four new and old deputy commanders were here for the first time. Qi Dangua, one of the general's adopted sons, was also standing on one side. Yuzhou Provincial Governor Hu Kuei and Yuzhou General Huang Fuqiu stood side by side. Liangzhou Provincial Governor Wang Peifeng, who had just been promoted from Yuzhou Provincial Governor to a higher position, was trembling with fear. This Beiliang Provincial Governor, who could be said to have made a name for himself, was standing alone in the most remote corner. Obviously, on this occasion, the fart of any other armored general would be more effective than him, a civil official shouting at the top of his lungs. But the person that shocked Huang Laifu the most was the second princess, Su Weisheng. She sat in a wheelchair, her hands interlaced as she stared at the map of the border on the table. The Beiliang Protector General held an inkstone in one hand and a brush in the other. The ink in the inkstone was crimson-red ink. Chu Lushan stood by Su Weisheng's side, bending over to draw red lines on the map while constantly speaking softly. Huang Laifu tiptoed over. There were already 20-some people standing on both sides of the table, so he could only find a place to sit. He just happened to hear Chu Lushan say in a low voice, "Earlier we sent a ballista archer into the heart of Gusai province and discovered that Lu Gui's army had already set out. Now we can confirm that they're heading for Liuzhou. Other than Lu Gui's 30,000 elite soldiers, the 4 military towns to the south, including tile-building Gentleman's Pavilion, have also moved out in full force. The old noble clans of Longguan have also brought out 30,000 infantry, and there are also the 8,000 Chong cavalry from Gusai province that require our attention. Together these 100,000 soldiers are all heading for the current capital of Liuzhou, Azure City." Chu Lushan used his brush to point at a certain area north of Azure City. The 30,000 infantry from the noble clans of Longguan will be used as the main force to attack the city. This much is obvious. Then he lightly drew a line between Azure City and Linyao military town. If nothing unexpected happens, the 8,000 Chong cavalry will be waiting here to tie down the reinforcements on the western front of Liuzhou. If they can win, they fight. If they can't win, they run. The Chong cavalry doesn't have any other abilities, but their ability to run is top-notch. I've already experienced it for myself more than a decade ago. The generals in the room all smiled knowingly. During the first Northern Mang-Liyang battle, everyone knew that Chu Lushan, who shone brilliantly in the smoke of battle, had 2 regrets. The first was that he wasn't able to kill Dong Zhuo, who was also a fatty, and the second was that he actually wasn't able to chase down that routed Chong cavalry. Chu Lushan moved the tip of his brush, drawing a line between Liuzhou and Azure City. As the main force, Lu Gui's army should be here. Su Weisheng frowned. When he heard this, he interrupted Chu Lushan's words. Are they just going to retreat and let Lu Gui infiltrate Liuzhou? Even if Liuzhou only has 30,000 Longxiang army, they don't have to be so passive. Ancestor Gu bent over the map with his hands behind his back. He slowly said, if we say that Liuzhou and Yuzhou borders can wait, then Liuzhou doesn't need to wait. The 30,000 Longxiang army only needs to find Lu Gui's main force and defeat them. The rest of the scattered soldiers are nothing to be afraid of. Beiliang has this ability outside the gates of the Kingdom of War. The deputy commander of the cavalry, He Zhong, suddenly said, don't look at how Lu Gui's side has the advantage in numbers. This amount of soldiers isn't enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. Even if Dong Zhuo has a backup plan based on their current deployment, there won't even be enough time to collect the corpses of their warhorses. Chu Lushan extended 2 fingers and pinched the crimson tip of his brush. He turned a deaf ear to He Zhong's words. He only stared at his slightly ink-stained fingers and calmly said, the bait is too small to catch a big fish. Chu Lushan suddenly laughed. In the silent room it was particularly eye-catching. This Protector General stuck his thumb and index finger together and raised his hand. He smiled and said, "Our Bailiang cavalry is too strong. We have to give our opponents a little bit of hope." Chapter 1269. There are only 2 chapters today. There was a side room in the Huayang Pass Protectorate Manor. Rumor had it that there were a bunch of petty officials gathered there. They were all insignificant officials who were neither learned nor trained in martial arts. However, the Protector General would often enter this side room. Other than that, this side room was rarely visited. Contrary to what the outside world had imagined, the side room was not desolate. There were only a few old pedants gathered together inside. On the contrary, it was very lively. Many young faces had appeared, making the room seem particularly lively. There were maps hanging on the east and west walls of the room. There were maps of the borders of Bailiang and the 2 provinces of Beimang. The maps on the 2 walls were the same. The only difference was that they were old. The east wall was old while the west wall was new. There were 2 people sitting at a table in the room. There was always a person standing at the table with a brush in his hand, in charge of recording some words. The tables were piled with Beimang records and secret files. Many of these things were probably not even available to the Southern Dynasty's Ministry of War and Ministry of Revenue. The reason why the east and west walls were divided into old and new ones was a suggestion made by a junior in the room. Since the enemy's commander-in-chief, Dong Zhuo, had been biding his time and did not show any signs of mobilizing troops, Bailiang might as well investigate the changes in the 2 provinces of Beimang that bordered Liangmang over the past few years. They circled the cities and towns that had increased their military strength in recent years, as well as the new courier routes that had been opened at great expense. They also focused on finding out the training grounds at the Beimang border over the years. The young man who gave this suggestion was surnamed Yu. It was said that he was an idle scholar who had gone to Liangmang to seek refuge in the Yamen, where he could not get enough money. Only then did he enter the room through his connections. There were 6 or 7 other miscellaneous officials who entered the room at the same time as Yu. Some of them were sons of generals who had studied the military and were born with a scholarly air. There were also some who had similar backgrounds as Yu. They were all scholars from other provinces who were picked up by others. Their ambitions were higher than the sky, but their lives were thinner than paper. Most of the older seniors in the room were frustrated people who had not made a name for themselves in the officialdom. They had one thing in common. Their necks were hard and their knees were even harder. They did not know how to bow and bend their knees. Usually they liked to drown their sorrows in alcohol. Once they drank too much, they would naturally be unable to control their mouths and talk about the state affairs. Then one day they would suddenly be taken to the border by the Whispering Room's spies. They did not even have the chance to say goodbye to their families before they disappeared into thin air. At first they were scared witless, thinking that they were going to be beheaded by the temperamental Great Demon Chu. Later they found out that they were just helping to analyze the situation of the war. Gradually they calmed down. However, although they had become guests of the Protectorate General and were working for the Protectorate General, they did not have any official rank or salary. They were neither in heaven nor on earth, so it was not a pleasant job. Fortunately, these people had long worn away their ambitions in the officialdom. They were able to endure the dull and tedious work in the room. In addition, Lord Chu Lushan's reputation was too frightening. Every one of them was cautious and conscientious. They were afraid that one day Chu Lushan would feel that they were officials who did not want to work hard without complaint. Then with a crack their heads would be chopped off. The outsiders who often came in and out of the room were all people who had walked out of the Fu Shui room. They constantly sent strange things to the people in the room. There were documents on the recent promotions of the Ministry of War, reports from the Ministry of Revenue on the amount of grain that had been lost in various places. There were even papers of different textures. Specific details such as which beacon and which relay road had been repaired were written down. These Fu Shui room spies came and went hurriedly. When they entered the room they did not say a word. They put down the secret records and silently left, their eyes never looking sideways. In the words of Sir Hong, who was temporarily in charge of the room, they were ruthless people who killed without blinking and slept without closing their eyes. The older ones like Sir Hong believed in doing more and speaking less. At most they would occasionally sigh with emotion. As for the young man called Yu Diji, he was even more like a newborn calf that was not afraid of a tiger. He dared to speak freely in the room. The young scholar Li Yu and Zhao Ying, whose father was the county magistrate of Lingzhou, had a great argument 2 days ago about whether the Beimang army should be attacking Liuzhou or not. The argument was so earth-shattering that even Sir Chu was alarmed. At dusk, Sir Hong, whose eyesight was not good, even though he was sitting by the window where the light was the best, he still lit an oil lamp. When he turned his head, he heard the sound of light footsteps that he was used to. Turning his head, he saw an extremely young and tender Fu Shui room spy. After entering the room, he handed over a letter to Wang Guifeng, who was in charge of receiving the item. Sir Hong no longer feared these people who had once made all of the Bailiang officials feel their hairs stand on end. It was not that Sir Hong was bold, but after all he was working for the Protector General. It was no different from having a golden protective talisman stuck to his forehead. What was there to be afraid of? However, it was impossible for Sir Hong to have a good impression of these people. It was not just him. Most of the people in the room did not want to have anything to do with the Fu Shui room. Sir Hong inadvertently discovered that after his old friend Wang Guifeng and the young spy walked out, he revealed a carefully concealed expression of disdain and bad luck. He used his fingers to pinch the document and quickly placed it on the young man Yudiji's desk. Sir Hong stood up and pretended to look at the map on the wall. When he passed by Yudiji's desk, he saw that it was a page that had been casually torn off by someone. Most of it was soaked in blood, but the blood had already dried. Chapter 1270. Sir Hong shook his head helplessly. These spies from the Fu Shui chamber were too careless. The things they sent over every few days were either wrinkled as if they had been pulled out of the water, or grit could still be shaken out of them. Today it was even more exaggerated. It was even stained with blood. In the dusk outside the room, the young spy raised his arm and fiercely wiped his eyes. Then he walked down the steps and left with large strides. The spy saw a young man in casual clothes standing at the door to the courtyard. The two looked at each other. The spy's eyes were filled with well-hidden wariness. His intuition told him that if this person was an enemy he would probably die. The two brushed past each other. Even though the young spy knew that this person could appear in the protectorate personally watched by Sir Chu, he was definitely not a spy from Beimang. However, the young man still subtly bent down slightly, one hand tucked into his sleeve. Only when the distance between them increased did he feel relieved. He realized that his hand holding the dagger was covered in sweat. The young spy was somewhat curious. That person was not very old, so why was he able to make him unconsciously assume a posture as if he was facing a great enemy? When Su Fengyan quietly walked into the room, Wang Guifeng, whose desk was near the door, raised his eyelids. He only thought that this was another spy from the Fu Shui chamber. He stood up and extended his hand. Su Fengyan asked quietly, "Where is the thing that was just sent over?" Yudiji suddenly raised his head. Just as he was about to speak, he saw the incognito king of Beimang shake his head slightly. He understood and stood up, handing the paper to Su Fengyan. He was none other than Yu Wandao, the eldest grandson of the Yu family, a powerful clan in the Central Plains. His pseudonym was Yu Diji and he worked as a handyman in this house. He was a nobody and he spent all his time picking and choosing from those secret records and documents. In fact, as long as Yu Wandao wanted to get an official position, Hu Kuei, the provincial governor of Liangzhou, who was deeply respected by Su Fengyan, could make him a fourth-rank general, not to mention others. The piece of paper that Yu Wandao handed to Su Fengyan was a page from the famous prose collection, Small Window Leisure, written by Lu Jingsheng, the literary giant of the former Southern Tang dynasty. It was widely circulated among the remaining elders of the spring and autumn period. However, the pages of this Southern Tang edition could not be considered very valuable, and the text on the page was also very popular. However, the line of hastily written words added at the end of the page might not be worth 1,000 gold, but it was definitely more valuable than the life of the writer. Before the great battle, the scouts would die first. But many people didn't know that spies would die earlier. Moreover, they would only die silently. It couldn't even be considered tragic. Yu Wandao wanted to open his mouth to explain that those scattered, obscure and unwritten words should be linked together in the secret file unique to Fu Shui room to explain why. Outsiders didn't know that Fu Shui room had an extremely hidden book of explaining words. Different death warriors and spies corresponded to their own written explanations. Therefore, even if a secret spy report was intercepted by Beimang, it would still be meaningless. The spy who sent this page was codenamed 24 Foot in Fu Shui room. Yu Wandao needed to flip to the 24th chapter of the Book of Explaining Words on his desk to obtain the exact content. Su Fengyan was silent. Tightly holding the page, he walked to the wall and raised his head to look at a map of Gusai Prefecture. Zhou was confused. Unlike those inflexible spies of Fu Shui room, he guessed that this person might be the son of a general who was related to some important figure in the protectorate. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to walk into this room. Looking at the situation, Yu Dizhi, whom he and Wang Guifeng privately said was Yu Dizhi, was most likely familiar with this person. Zhou pulled on Yu Dizhi's sleeve and said softly, "Little Yu, is this your friend? This is against the rules. If the Protector General finds out, you and I will both have to bear the consequences." Yu Wandao said softly, "It's fine." Even the usually easygoing Zhou couldn't help but feel anxious. The rules set by Protector General Chu were greater than the sky at the border of Bailiang. How could a little scholar say it was fine? When the time came, everyone in the room would be implicated by Yu Dizhi, who had broken the rules. Just as Zhou was about to remind the young man that it was time to leave the room, he suddenly heard the man murmur, "The historian's family is unfortunate, the country is fortunate, the country does not prosper, the family prospers." Zhou, who had studied hard for many years, immediately understood. Wasn't this a passage written by the great Southern Tang prose master Lu Jingsheng in Small Window Leisure? Next, Zhou saw the young man gently smooth out the wrinkled page and hand it back to Yu Dizhi. Yu Wandao took the page and handed it to Zhou. He said indifferently, "Zhou, this page can be filed away. I have already deciphered the words on the page. In a moment I'll have to trouble you to have someone send it to Protector General Chu's study." Zhou took the page and glanced at it. He didn't have a deep impression. He only felt that the strokes were stiff and the transitions were stagnant. The woman played with the blade and the man embroidered flowers. It was truly unsightly. Zhou suddenly raised his head and saw the young man looking at him expressionlessly. He was immediately frightened. But soon the young man smiled and said softly, "Does Sir feel that the words on the page are somewhat unsightly?" Having been seen through, Zhou smiled awkwardly and didn't know how to respond. That person didn't make a fuss and only raised his voice slightly. "Everyone in the room has worked hard." After saying this, Zhou didn't have time to criticize before he walked straight to the door. Zhou first saw Wang Guifeng standing dumbstruck at the door. Then he saw Bailiang's Protector General Chu Lushan, Cavalry Commander Yuan Zuozong, Infantry Commander Yan Wenluan, and many other people standing behind them. Zhou didn't dare to keep looking. If this wasn't shocking enough, then what made Zhou's scalp tingle was that the young man had just stepped over the threshold and walked out. Outside the house, a small group of people who deserved to be called the most powerful people in northern Liang were all making way for him. Chapter 1271. In the main hall of the Governor-General's office, Yan Wenluan looked at the young man wearing a black robe embroidered with gold. For some reason his mind wandered. He remembered that when the general had put on Prince Liang's blue satin robe, he, Zhong Honggu, and Lu Yuanji couldn't help but go up and touch it. Of this group of old people, other than He Zhonghu and Qin Yunque, Zhong Honggu was dead. Wei Taishan and Lu Yuanji had retired from the army and returned home to retire. As for the younger group, only half of the general's 6 adopted sons were left. Yan Wenluan, as an important leader of Chongling's mountain, naturally had high hopes for Qin Jibao. In the old man's mind, Bailiang's best day was when Su Fengyan was stationed outside Qin Jibao's battle pass in Liangzhou. It was a pity that he would not be able to see this scene in this lifetime. Yan Wenluan gathered his thoughts. At this time, Su Fengyan was asking Chu Lushan about the movements of the Beimang army. Chu Lushan could not give a definite answer. Even though Bailiang's spies and crossbowmen had suffered great losses, Dongzhu's messy deployment of troops confused the Governor-General's office. This was like a celestial phenomenon expert facing off against a Xian finger expert. He had the advantage but did not attack openly. At the same time, he did not play any sinister sneak attacks. Instead, he threw a flurry of punches on his own territory. He was not afraid of losing his footing. Su Fengyan joked. A large-scale shift of hundreds of thousands of troops is not child's play. This means that an astronomical amount of food and soldiers will be needed to support it. Fatty Dong is showing off his wealth to Bailiang? As one of the border commanders, Great Ancestor Gu's relationship with the new Prince Liang was purer than Yan Wenluan, Qin Yunque, and He Zhonghu. After all, they had met outside Baoyang and had been an honored guest invited by Su Fengnian. So great ancestor Gu had more leeway in his words. He smiled and agreed. In any case, it is not really the wealth of this great king of the south courtyard. It will not hurt to squander it. Chu Lushan's fingers were crossed in front of his chest, his thick arms resting on the armrests. His eyes narrowed, his lips moving as though he was talking to himself. Su Fengnian looked at great ancestor Gu. Before he could say anything, the #1 general of the old southern Tang straightened his back, straightened his clothes and said telepathically, "Prince Liang wants to ask if we can fight outside the border?" Su Fengnian nodded. The fall of the old southern Tang was because they had given Gu Jiantang all the initiative on the battlefield. All the elite troops withdrew into the territory, which led to the destruction of the navy and the subsequent defeat. Otherwise, according to great ancestor Gu's strategy, Gu Jiantang would have to pay at least 200,000 more casualties to take down the southern Tang. More importantly, the southern Tang could use this opportunity to build up their morale and not be afraid to fight to the death. Baoyang claimed to have 300,000 cavalrymen. Of course, not all of the 300,000 border soldiers were cavalrymen. In fact, only half of them were cavalrymen. But even if they had 150,000 cavalrymen and a jaw-dropping supply of hundreds of thousands of war horses, this was definitely the reason why Baoyang dared to compete with Baimang. It could be said that if Baoyang did not have anything to worry about and if the imperial court had enough support, such an invincible cavalryman with impeccable equipment and combat power could take the initiative to attack the northwest border and look for opportunities. The reason was simple. Compared to Baimang, Baoyang's territory was considered small. They could attack from all sides and maintain their advantage in numbers in a single battlefield. Even if the cavalrymen of Baoyang were on par with the border soldiers of Baimang, or even slightly inferior, they could still defeat the border soldiers of Baimang without any suspense. Then they would resupply and move to the next battlefield. The current predicament Baoyang was facing was that the imperial court had made up its mind to watch the fire burn across the river. Not only was there no way to retreat in the direction of western Shu, after the turmoil in Ji province and Yuan Tingshan became the strongest in Ji province, even the right side of Baoyang had become a hidden danger. It was true that Gu Jiantang could not meddle with the internal affairs of Baoyang, but it was easy for him to do something between Liao province and Baoyang. Great ancestor Gu kept them in suspense and said with a playful smile, "It's not impossible, but it depends on whether Baoyang has the courage or not." Yan Wenluan smiled and said, "General Gu mentioned something a few days ago. He said that it's not difficult to defend the mouth of the bottle gourd with the current Yuzhou army. The Yuzhou infantrymen are enough. Then the 30,000 cavalrymen can sweep through Ji province and gain more geographical advantage for Baoyang. When the war between Liangzhou and Yuzhou is in a stalemate, the 30,000 cavalrymen can take an arc and directly attack Longyao province. In this way, Baoyang will not be in a dead-end situation where they can only be beaten. But Ji province." Chapter 1272. At this point, Yan Wenluan purposely left it blank. He Zhonghu and Chen Yunchui's gazes crossed each other, and then they both looked at Su Fengnian. Since the beginning of summer in the first year of Xiangfu, the current emperor had displayed a stance that puzzled everyone in court. Even if Yang Xinxing's troops had failed, even if Yan Zhenchuan's cavalry had been completely annihilated, the emperor did not show too much anger. Although the position of commander-in-chief Lu Xingxiang was shaky in the wind and rain, this was not caused by the unfavorable battle situation. Instead, it was a bleak situation from the beginning, and now there were signs of it becoming more and more stable. After Yan Zhenchuan died in battle, it could be said that he was extremely honored. He was posthumously given the title of Wuxia, and posthumously given the title of Jingzhong Marquis. His only son Yan Daiden immediately received an exceptional promotion. Yang Xinxing was trapped and lost the face of the court. However, it was said that a secret memorial was sent to the emperor, adding fuel to the fire for the Imperial College's Jean Lanting to impeach Grand Secretary Zhang Julu. It should have saved the lives of the Yang family, and it was not impossible for them to return to Jizhou in the future. Compared to the defeated Guangling Road, the emperor of the Zhao family obviously placed more attention on the calm Jizhou. He personally approved many memorials. Outsiders did not know the inside story, but Baoyang's side, especially Yan Wenluan and the other military leaders, knew very well that the emperor's wariness towards Cao Chongqing and the rest of the West Chu rebels who were causing trouble under his nose was far less than the Bailiang cavalry. Su Fengnian did not give a direct answer but said softly, Qin Jibao cut off the west line of Liang, which should be the first step of Yuan Binxi's plan. The second step is to let Jizhou approach step by step. In the past, Yang Xinxing did not have the ability to do so. Even if he wanted to keep Bailiang in check, his tens of thousands of old soldiers in Jinan were unable to do so. The imperial court simply let him go to Guangling Road and hit a wall. Because of this, the local forces in Jizhou were cut off. Taking this opportunity, the imperial court needs a trustworthy new person to fill the gap. Not only must he be able to convince the public, he must also have the courage to challenge Bailiang. That mad dog Yuan's meteoric rise should be a business deal between Yuan Binxi and Gu Jiantang. Yuan Binxi can further restrain Bailiang, and Gu Jiantang can be more assured in the periphery of the east line. Everyone is happy. Great Ancestor Gu sneered, this mad dog really wants to be the new master of Jizhou. How can it be so easy to sit on the seat of the new master of Jizhou? Bailiang really can't stop him. Compared to Western Shu, Jizhou is even more of a pushover. The first thing Gu Jiantang will do is to be beaten into a sieve by Beimang's iron cavalry. Even if Yuan Tingshan is the son-in-law of the Gu family, can he really be compared to his own son? Chu Lushan laughed and said, wealth comes from danger. Small people are always like this when they go to the gambling table. If they want to gamble, they will gamble big. They are never afraid of losing their family fortune. Speaking of which, when we fought with my foster father from the north to the south, we also put ourselves in the same situation. Although Yuan Tingshan isn't likable, he's definitely very interesting. Su Fengnian suddenly turned to look at Yan Wenluan and asked, General Yan, if you only have infantry in Yuzhou, how many Beimang soldiers can you stop? Yan Wenluan said without hesitation, one gourd outside Tuma Pass can hold 150 to 60,000 Beimang soldiers. With Honglu General Chao Xiaojiao and Hong Xinjia as partners, they can both attack and defend at the border. Within Yuzhou there is also the Hu leader Huang Fuqiu. 300,000. It is not a problem for the Yuzhou infantry to stop 300,000 Beimang soldiers. However, there is a time limit to this. However, this time limit is enough for the 30,000 light cavalry to provide reinforcements or attack in an emergency. Su Fengnian laughed and said, all right then. These 30,000 light cavalry will enter Jizhou from today onwards. General Qin Yunxiao's eyes lit up and asked, are we not going to inform the imperial court? Su Fengnian replied with a question. Our Bailiang is only sending 2,000 or 3,000 cavalry to Jizhou to train. Do we need to inform them? That would be treating His Majesty as an outsider. Moreover, after going to Jizhou, the imperial court will know one day. Isn't that the same as informing them? At most, we will just have to submit another document to the Ministry of War. Su Weisheng, who was sitting beside Su Fengnian, laughed softly and said, it is clear that our Bailiang is reasonable. Qin Yunxiao suppressed his laughter. He Zhong, who was also in a good mood, could not help but laugh out loud. Your Highness, the difference between 3,000 and 30,000 seems a bit big. He Zhong suddenly waved his hand and said, 3,000 and 30,000 are only 20,000. It is not 30,000 and 300,000. Whoever wants to argue about this can argue about it. Moreover, that Minister Liu of the Ministry of War is our Highness's elder by marriage. Regardless of whether it is on the side of family or on the side of reason, Tangshi Sword Immortal should be helped. Su Fengnian rubbed his face and asked, in the past this cavalry was made up of scattered generals and captains. If they go to Jizhou, who will lead them? Do any of you have a suitable candidate? As the general of Bailiang's 160,000 infantry, Yan Wenluan was not in a position to interrupt. After all, this was a family matter of the cavalry. Yuan Zuozong could speak, Chu Lushan could speak, and even some of the infantry generals could speak freely. However, this famous general from the spring and autumn period was too prominent, so he should be silent. However, Yan Wenluan still spoke bluntly, I have two candidates for the position of commander and deputy commander. The commander must be more astute in the use of troops than in the proper way, while the deputy commander must be relatively prudent, more proper than astute. This will allow the two of them to complement each other and prevent the cavalry from being too lame. The vice-general can be my subordinate, Zhong Tianheng. As for the general, your highness will have to use different people. Su Fengnian smiled and said, Old general, please speak. Yan Wenluan glanced at Chu Lushan and said, "Then I will have to borrow someone from Protector General Chu." Chu Lushan stared and said, "No. Even if you beat me to death, I will not lend him to you. That kid is an important person in the Protectorate and is also my right-hand man. In the future I will have to rely on this kid." Su Fengyin could not help but be puzzled. Who was this extraordinary person that Lu Qiuer and Yan Wenluan liked? Yan Wenluan snorted coldly. "It is not me who wants to borrow someone from you. It is His Highness who wants to borrow someone from you." Su Weisheng said indifferently, "Yu Luandao is indeed qualified to lead this cavalry." Su Fengyin suddenly understood. Chu Lushan's expression was as if dozens of pounds of meat had been cut off in an instant. He sighed. Su Fengyin smiled and said, "Then it is settled. Let us go take a look at the topographic map of Ji Province and discuss how to move these 30,000 people." The group of people walked to the front of a few tables. Someone had already brought over 2 maps. One was the geographical map of the entire Ji Province, and the other was the topographic map of Jishi. In the northern Liang military there were countless of such maps. When Su Fengyin sent someone to invite Yu Luandao over, he stood in front of the table and looked around. Suddenly he said in a low voice, "From today onwards, we in Beiliang will do what we are supposed to do. If the imperial court and Ji province dare to interfere, then we will cut off their hands and feet. In the future, if there is a conflict with any forces outside Beiliang, there is no need to inform the Mount Qing Liang Wang estate. Do it first, and after it is done the Wang estate will help clean up the mess." Yan Wenluan, Qin Yunchui and the other old generals all let out a long sigh at the same time. He could finally vent the resentment that he had held in for nearly 20 years in an open and above-board manner. Chapter 1273. Although the weather was cold, there was no snow. If one did not personally go to the frontier fortress, it would be difficult to understand the feeling of stars hanging over the vast plains. Su Fengyin accompanied Su Weisheng out of the Huayang Pass and a few miles outside the Huayang Pass. He was accompanied only by Chu Lushan. The old General Yan Wenluan and the new Yu Luandao of the Dragon Gate had already rushed to Yuzhou to take charge of military affairs. The latter gave Su Fengyin a report before he left, specifically describing the analysis of the battle situation in Guangling Road, focusing on Ko Jianghuai's series of raids from one point to the other. Large-scale cavalry battles in the wilderness had always been a scene that could only be seen on the frontier battlefield. In the hinterland of the Central Plains, large and small cities were scattered like stars in the sky and blocked by rivers, making it extremely difficult for cavalry to perform. To be precise, it was extremely difficult for cavalry to fight a battle in one go. It was not difficult to fight one or several exciting battles, but to fight to the end, abandoning the infantry and using the cavalry to the greatest extent, it was a test of the ability of the commander. Chu Lushan used the faint starlight to read the report carefully along the way, admiring it so much that he could not put it down. When Su Fengyin and Su Weisheng stopped at a small broken ground, Chu Lushan carefully put away the priceless rice paper, looked at the sky and sighed softly. Lu Xingxiang's proudest work in his life was that snowy night in Luzhou, helping Gu Jiantang take down the entire Dongyue without shedding a drop of blood. As for me, I was fortunate enough to not fail my mission when thousands of cavalry marched into Shu. In the past 10 years, these 2 battles have been deduced countless times by the old scholars who teach the art of war in Shangyin Academy and Imperial College. But in my opinion, this unruly Ko Jianghuai in West Chu's new imperial court is much better than me and that assistant minister Lu. No wonder Yu Luandao, a proud and arrogant son of a powerful family, is willing to praise another son of the same age. Su Weisheng reached out his hand to ask Chu Lushan for the stack of rice paper, put it on his knee and casually pulled out a page, saying flatly, "Ko Jianghuai is recognized as a generalist in Shangyin Academy, but in the eyes of some scholars he is somewhat miscellaneous and not a master. I have played a few games with him." Su Fengyin could not help but interrupt. "Second sister, can this kid beat you in a game of chess?" Su Weisheng raised his head and stared blankly at Su Fengyin. Su Fengyin smiled embarrassedly and quickly shut his mouth. Chu Lushan caught a glimpse of this scene. In today's world, there were very few people who could make the young king of Beiliang admit defeat, and he could not help but laugh. In the end, Su Fengyin was afraid of the strong and picked on the weak. He glared fiercely at the gloating Chu Lushan, and the Protector General could only resentfully withdraw his smile. It must be known that a person who could make him admit defeat was equally difficult to find in the two imperial courts. Zhou Xian continued, most of the people I have played against are national chess players. Among them, Ko Jianghuai is undoubtedly the weakest. However, this person's thoughts are the most unconstrained and there is no set pattern to the game. He can play frighteningly strong moves, but he can also play stupid moves that do not make any sense, and he can also shamelessly play all the way to the end. These are not surprising. What is truly impressive about Ko Jianghuai is that he has the least desire to win. This kind of opponent is very difficult to deal with on the battlefield. Prince of Guangling Zhao Yi has clearly suffered enough. On the eastern front of West Chu, Ko Jianghuai, with inferior military strength, within 20 years, consecutively captured Huangyan Pass, including Daijai's and 6 other dangerous cities. They obtained the cities but did not defend them, giving up a temporary struggle for territory and striving to obtain an overwhelming military superiority over the enemy on a single battlefield. They nibbled away the reinforcements bit by bit, making large movements and long-distance raids. This kind of seemingly unreasonable military strategy is indeed worthy for us, Beimang, who is at a disadvantage compared to Beiliang, to learn from. Probably because he was tired of standing, Chu Lushan sat down on the grass next to Zhou Xian's wheelchair. Unexpectedly, the height of his head was still about the same as Zhou Xian's. It could be seen that this head of Beiliang's officials, Lu Qiuer's body was very large. After entering the winter, the withered grass was sparse, so he did not feel uncomfortable. He laughed and said, after the restoration of the country, West Chu's situation is quite similar to our Beiliang's. We have almost become fellow sufferers who sympathize with each other. Under the joint suppression of the 2 southern armies and several vassal kings, Chu Lushan is really like a snail in its shell. If Cao Chongqing personally went into action, forcing Yang Xinxing to be unable to use his strength, Yan Zhenchuan's death in battle could be considered reasonable. But right now West Chu only sent 2 young generals into action, and it has already caused the Zhao imperial court to be in a terrible fix. Zhao Yi had no choice but to bring out the spring snow building's auspicious general. Presumably, the battle in Guangling will not be as short as 3 months or as long as half a year as predicted by the elders of the Liang Ministry of War, and it will not even be as long as we Beiliang predicted at that time. By the time the last wisp of smoke dissipates, I am afraid it will take at least 2 years. Su Fengyan laughed coldly and said, the Zhao family Son of Heaven used the New Year's auspicious talisman. His original intention was to create a new atmosphere. A new atmosphere is indeed a new atmosphere, but it is not the least bit joyous. Suppressing Beiliang and indulging Guangling, these were all created by him. I don't know if he has any regrets. Other than handing over the dragon robe and dragon throne to Crown Prince Zhaozhuan, there is also this big mess. Chapter 1274. Zhou Xian shook his head and said in a low voice, the Zhao family is good at fishing in troubled waters in the middle of the game and making the final decision at the end of the game. Losing the first move, the Zhao family, compared to the remote Liang in the past, has a bigger family and a bigger business, so they can afford to lose more. The only difference is that in the past, the imperial court had our Su family as their vanguard. Moreover, no matter how anxious the previous emperor was on the surface, he still trusted our father and the Su family's armored cavalry. If not for the current emperor's insistence on nailing the Su family to the northwest border, would Cao Chongqing and the remaining elders of West Chu dare to start a rebellion and seek their own death? If the Beiliang frontier army could send out 50,000 men to quell the rebellion, how could Yang Xinxing and Yan Zhenchun lose their integrity in their later years? Chu Lushan said darkly, there's nothing we can do about it. The Zhao family's emperor is determined to be the enemy of the world. The feudal princes who split the territory, the new civil officials who gradually gathered together, and the military generals who set up independent territories, in his eyes, none of them are good people. He wants to help his son solve this problem before he dies. The chessboard is too small to accommodate so many big chess pieces. If he really did succeed, the Crown Prince Zhaozhuan could really be a carefree emperor who doesn't attach importance to martial arts and focuses on civil affairs. Gu Jiantang has Qin Zhibao holding him back. Without Zhang Julu, the civil officials have no leader. When the time comes, they would be too busy trying to figure out the emperor's heart. How could they care about governing the country and pacifying the world? Besides, at that time the world would be at peace. The military generals would have retired to their fields, so it would be even less of a chance for the civil officials to fish for merit. Other than currying favor with the emperor, the civil officials after Yong Hui really have nothing to do. Don't say that old man Yuan Binshi's calculations are very smooth. Su Fingyan waved his hand and said, there's no point in talking about this. Right now Dongzhuo's specific deployment of troops and generals, other than the direction of Liuzhou, there are no detailed intelligence reports. Luqiu, how long do you think Liuzhou can hold off Lu Gui's army? After that, how many Beimang border troops can be implicated and thrown into the pocket of Liuzhou? With a smile on his face, Chu Lushan said, with Little Prince's 30,000 Longxiang army helping to defend Lu province, they would not be able to defeat Lu Gui's hundreds of thousands of disorganized troops even if they were to fight for 100 years. In the eyes of future generations, no matter how we fought in the early stages of this unprecedented war with Beimang, there was no better or worse strategy. It all depended on who could accumulate advantages in the divided battlefields. From the current situation, Dongzhuo clearly did not put too much thought into Liuzhou. He invited the most prestigious and also the youngest of the 13 great generals, border commander Lu Gui, to that side because he did not wish for Lu Gui to take advantage of the situation to rise up in the central plains. At the very least, he did not want Lu Gui to rise up too quickly and too fiercely. What I am most worried about is that Dongzhuo will attack Yuzhou in a spurt of energy, attacking the Yuzhou defense line to the death without regard for losses. In the meantime, he will place his most elite troops, the Tuoba and Hong Jingyan, on the northern front of Liangzhou to tie down the main force of our cavalry. Su Weisheng nodded and said, if we attack Yuzhou in the short term, it will be the most muddle-headed method Beimang can use. However, in the long term, it will be the best method to preserve Beimang's national strength. After all, Beiliang is not the central plains which has a great depth. Even if Yuzhou has a few cities that can be defended, and there are many fortresses and military cities south of the mouth of the gourd, the saying that the mouth of the gourd alone can swallow up 160,000 soldiers is not an exaggeration. However, as long as Beimang has the courage to do so, they will only have to send out 100,000 soldiers to cripple Yuzhou. Next, they will have to rely on Liangzhou's main force to reinforce Yuzhou. Once this situation develops, whether or not Liuzhou is defended will no longer affect the overall situation. This is also the reason why Yan Wenluan insisted that Yu Wandao lead 30,000 light cavalry to Jizhou. He was determined to use Yuzhou to win more time and space for all of Beiliang. However, this is an action that has no choice. In the end, they will lose more than they lose. The Liang imperial court is happy to see this, but Beiliang cannot afford it. Su Weisheng folded his hands on the paper on his knees and looked into the distance. Bodyguard Chu insisted on having Liuzhou enter a stalemate, attracting the attention of both the north and south imperial courts of Beimang. He hoped that Beimang's border army would send troops to Liuzhou, but he was also worried that Dongzhuo would focus on attacking Yuzhou. Over the past decade or so, father has poured a lot of effort into Yuzhou and spent a lot of money on the soldiers. 7 years ago, during the raid led by the Dragon Waste province, he purposely stopped the border army of Liangzhou from reinforcing Yuzhou. He watched as the 30,000 soldiers of Yuzhou lost their cities and fortresses one after another and sacrificed their lives for the northern barbarians. He wanted to make Beimang fear Yuzhou's border army, and hoped that one day, Yuzhou would not become their fatal weakness. Chu Lushan said in a low voice, "Merciful people don't command troops." Chu Lushan suddenly exhaled a mouthful of turbid air. That old woman has been purging Beimang's Jianghu forces for many years. Now she can finally be put to use. On the border, those experts are keeping a close eye on the big and small passes. As long as they see someone quietly crossing the border, they will kill him on the spot regardless of his identity. Many of our men of sacrifice spies who have been lurking for many years can hardly pass on important military intelligence. This time, the chess and sword music school and the Princess Grave have all been mobilized to seal off the news from the border and cooperate with Dongzhuo's border army. This move is really ruthless. Fu Shui Room has suffered heavy losses after being traced back to Beimang. Many provinces have been uprooted after many years of operations. Chu Lushan, who was squatting on the ground, rubbed his cheeks. That's not all. Not long ago, Beimang deliberately let a spy return. He had 16 heads of his colleagues from Fu Shui Room in his luggage. When the spy saw me, he cried and said that if it wasn't for the fact that he hoped Fu Shui Room could take back these heads, he would rather die than return to Beiliang. After the spy put down his luggage, he borrowed a cold knife and committed suicide that night. He didn't say his last words, he didn't write his will, he didn't leave anything behind. Zhou Xian said in a muffled voice, "Our new cold knife hasn't even started killing the northern barbarians, but it was used as a suicide by one of our own. If I continue to hold in this resentment, my lungs will explode from anger." Su Fengyan didn't say anything. His hands were clasped in the large sleeves of his purple gold embroidered robe. After winter, the continuous battle in Guangling Road had come to an end. It was Baoyang's turn to be engulfed in smoke. There was no snow this winter. No one knew when it would snow. However, the cold knives at the waists of the 300,000 border soldiers could be unsheathed at any time. Chapter 1275. More than 8,000 valiant Chong cavalry went from the border of Gusai Prefecture to between Qingcang and Linyao. Just as Zhou Xian had expected, the light armored Chong cavalry were used by Lu Gui to cut off the connection between the two towns. The Chong people were once a thorn in the side of the overlords of the Central Plains. The Dafeng dynasty had been harassed by the Chong people for a full 200 years. Every Chong person rode sheep to shoot birds and rats when they were young, and when they were slightly older they rode horses to shoot foxes and rabbits. They were basically born to be elite soldiers on horseback. The light cavalry of the various countries in the Central Plains had gradually stepped onto the stage. To a large extent it was because the Chong cavalry had forced them to do so. The Chong cavalry was also one of the teachers of the Central Plains. Before and after Su Shao took over Baoyang, the Chong people had withered day by day. This was especially so for the Su family, who often used large numbers of Chong cavalry to train their troops. This was undoubtedly a tragedy for the Chong people. As a result, the Chong people were natural allies of Baimang. This time, when they invaded the Central Plains, the various leaders of the Chong tribes all made peace with each other and made an oath. Under the lead of Baimang, they even formed an alliance with other tribes that had been suppressed by the Su family. Only then did they gather close to 9,000 cavalry and 20,000 war horses. Under the banner of the Chong cavalry, they started to take revenge on the Su family of Baoyang. This Chong cavalry that was originally impoverished along the endless border, under the great support of the northern Mang and southern dynasty, were finally able to realize their dream of several hundred years of being fully equipped with armor. Unlike ordinary cavalry, the Chong cavalry's cavalry blades were the arm blades that had already been withdrawn from the battlefield. The war blades were bound together with the arm armor, so unless the entire arm was chopped off, the blades would never leave their hands. Apart from the arm saber, the Chong cavalry also had a traditional short saber known as the piao. It was attached to the outside of the thigh like a farmer harvesting rice in autumn. They used it to cut off the ears and heads of their enemies as spoils of war. More than 8,000 Chong generals galloped towards the south. The leader of the group, a burly man, bent down and stroked his ancestral clapper. His eyes were filled with hatred. Years ago, when that Su family of the Central Plains slaughtered his way into the northwest, all the local adults who disobeyed his orders were killed on the spot. Even the children, who were no taller than a horse's back, could not escape the disaster. Although they were not executed, both their thumbs were cut off by the Su family's cavalry. This meant that even if these children were lucky enough to survive, they would not be able to hold their weapons firmly and swing their swords at the Baoyang frontier army. This middle-aged Madame Wan's surname was Jean. At the time when his tribe was trampled by the Su family's horses, he was lucky enough to follow a group of young men to hunt and store food for the winter. When they returned to the tribe, other than the corpses on the ground, there were only the children crying with their hands dripping with blood. Beside the children's feet were the corpses of their parents. He swore that he would personally use this clapper to cut off the thumbs of everyone in Baoyang with the surname Su. As long as they had the surname Su, even if they were infants, he would not let a single one go. This was especially true of that butcher's son, the person who had been usurped as the new prince of Liang. Not only would he cut off that young man's thumbs, but he would also cut off Su Fengyan's head, limbs and fingers one by one. This Madame Wan slowly straightened his back and looked towards the vast expanse of land to the south with a vicious smile on his face. He had heard that there was a butcher's son named Su Longxiang in Liuzhou. He was very famous among the nobles of the southern dynasties. Last year he had beaten up a few military towns in Gusai Prefecture. He did not expect to capture this person with less than 9,000 cavalry. However, before he worked with General Lu Gui to completely flatten Liuzhou, he had to drink the fresh blood of the Baoyang people. he had to make that young man who had butcher's dirty blood flowing through his veins suffer so much that he wished he was dead. The young man's Xiang army did not have more than 30,000 cavalry. Did he want to defend all of Liuzhou? In the eyes of the generals, this was just an old show between brothers in the Central Plains. It was clear that the young king was afraid of his younger brother's great achievements on the border, so he purposely left Zhou Xian and all of the young man's direct descendants to die. In the winter, the water dried up and the grass turned yellow. The war horses were not as strong as in the autumn and summer. In the eyes of the Central Plains, especially the Jiangnan people, it was the most unsuitable time for war. However, to the Liangmang people who had been on the border for a long time and were familiar with the harsh cold, as long as they were determined to fight, they could fight to the death on any battlefield, even in the damned snowy weather. On the contrary, the Chang generals Jin Qing liked fighting in the depths of winter the most. The scene of using a long spear to stab into the enemy's chest and then dragging out a bloody path in the snow was more enjoyable than drinking good wine. The Chang cavalry's galloping raids had always been known to be as fast as lightning. While they were praised, it also revealed the Chang cavalry's weakness, which was that they could only do one-off business on the battlefield. Although they could advance and retreat freely, before they obtained an absolute advantage and began a chase, it was very difficult to expand their battle results. They did not have infantry formations and did not have heavy cavalry holding the line. This time the Beimang emissary was extremely disrespectful to the Chang cavalry. Even though he had a request, he was still arrogant. Before discussing the price, he even said to their face that they were just decorations and that if they dared to ask for an exorbitant price, they should be careful not to lose their heads. He also threatened that if they did not act according to General Lu Gui's orders, they might as well not return to the border. When the time came, the Beimang army would directly view the Chang cavalry as an enemy. Jin Qing fiercely ground his teeth. If not for the fact that he wanted to take revenge on the Su family, who the hell would want to deal with these pig-headed officials? Jin Qing looked into the distance and suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of unease. The 8,000 Chang cavalry heading down south to cut off Qingcang and Linyao, leaving Qingcang City, the capital of Liuzhou, isolated and without help. In his eyes, this was indeed an excellent strategy that caught the enemy off guard, and the Chang cavalry did not have to take any risks. However, on the way down south he still had 20 or so roaming cavalry scouts at the front to scout the path. Every cavalry had to be 10 li away from the Chang cavalry army. No matter if they came into contact with the enemy or not, they had to turn back and let the second cavalry take their place. Logically speaking, at this time, one of the roaming cavalry should have returned to the front of the army. Furthermore, for this trip to Liuzhou, Beimang had specially given him a scout. It was an old fellow who exuded a dangerous aura. There was a sword at his waist and his aura was long and steady. He did not look like a soldier at all. Even if he used his butt to think, he knew that this was a hidden Jianghu master. It could be seen that Beimang had indeed invested a lot in this attack on Beiliang. They had even brought out the Jianghu forces that they had trained for 20 years. Jin Qing was not a madman who would be blinded by revenge. He knew the severity of the situation. Otherwise, he would not have become one of the generals. He had come to assist Lu Gui's army in taking advantage of the situation. What he was most afraid of was directly clashing with the main force of the Dragon Elephant cavalry. However, the Beimang emissary, who was dressed like a nobleman of the Central Plains, had promised that apart from a small portion of the 30,000 Xiang army, most of them would be pinned down at Qingcang City and the area to the east of Qingcang City. Otherwise, Beiliang would have treated Liuzhou as a chess piece and sacrificed the Xiang army, an elite cavalry force that had experienced hundreds of battles. However, Jin Qing, who was not a madman, began to worry that he would encounter a madman king of Beiliang who would do anything to stabilize his throne, as well as a general of the Xiang army who had lost his mind after becoming a chess piece. After waiting for a while, there was still no sign of any cavalry scouts. Frowning, Jin Qing raised his arm and waved it back and forth slightly, indicating for the cavalry behind him to slow down. About half an hour later, the figure of a scout finally appeared in the field of vision of the Chang cavalry. As the warhorse galloped over, Jin Qing and the other Kiliarchs were shocked to discover that there were numerous crossbow bolts stuck in the back of the scout. Before the heavily injured scout breathed his last, he did his best to speak of the precious military intelligence he had obtained by sacrificing the lives of more than 20 Chang cavalry. 8 li ahead, there were 3,000 enemy dragon elephant light cavalry. Chapter 1276. Major Jinqing was both happy and worried. He was happy that the other side only had 3,000 cavalry and wasn't the main force of the dragon elephant army. He was worried that his army was here to fish in troubled waters and not to fight to the death with the dragon elephant army that was said to be invincible at the border. There were two paths in front of the Chong cavalry. They could continue south and use their advantage in numbers to take down the 3,000 cavalry. They could grit their teeth and complete their mission of cutting off Lu province. However, the Chong cavalry would suffer heavy casualties, and they would not be able to bargain with the Beimang after they had secured victory in Lu province. The second path was to avoid the brunt of the attack and not fight to the death with the 3,000 dragon elephant light cavalry. However, they would also not retreat and instead advance in a roundabout manner. In the end, there would be unavoidable battles. At most, they would just fight for a while. With the Chong cavalry's speed, which had been the fastest in the world for hundreds of years, they could fight or retreat. Jinqing thought for a bit and then decisively chose the latter. Their Chong cavalry wasn't Northern Mang's million-strong army that could contend against the entire Liang dynasty. Compared to that pitiful Northern Liang that his uncle didn't dote on, the Chong clan was struggling at death's door. After Jinqing made his choice, two of the Kiliarchs revealed expressions of relief. One of the Kiliarchs, surnamed Ku, was extremely angry at Jinqing's cowardly behavior. He loudly reprimanded him from his horse and declared that he would lead his 1,600 Chong cavalry to fight to the death. Jinqing's face was gloomy. He patiently told this rash youth that although the dragon elephant light cavalry was inferior to the heavy cavalry, they were not an enemy that could be easily dealt with. If other than the 3,000 cavalry there was also the Longxiang army, then their 8,000 men would not be able to leave Lu province alive. However, the young Chiliarch who had seen all the male elders in his family being beheaded by the Su family when he was young did not listen at all. He insisted on fighting the enemy to the end and did not forget to mock and ridicule Jinqing, saying that he, as a Chiliarch, had embarrassed the men of the Chong tribe. Jinqing laughed coldly in his heart. He gently turned his horse and made way. "Kui, if you want to die, I will not stop you." The Kiliarchs raised his arm and the 1,000 Chong cavalry behind him roared in unison, waving their arm-binding blades. When the youngster named Ku Jiao's mount passed by the Jincheng warhorse, his expression became a bit calmer, saying with a sneer, "I am willing to use my clan's 1,600 cavalry as the vanguard. If Major General still wishes to obtain the first batch of military contributions in Liang Mang's great battle, I believe with Major General Great's astuteness, you should already understand what to do." Jinqing narrowed his eyes. He did not care about the sarcasm in this idiot's words and began to weigh the pros and cons. If Kui and his men were to use their lives to weaken the dragon elephant light cavalry, then if they won this battle, other than Kui, the losses of the Chong cavalry would not be too great. This deal could be done. The expressionless Jinqing watched as the 1,600 cavalry broke away from the main army and charged out. Seeing the cavalry whose faces were still full of childishness move further and further away, Jinqing suddenly had an untimely feeling. Had he gotten used to a peaceful life of wine and beautiful women? Was the hatred in his heart not as deep as he had imagined? Jinqing shook his head, trying to shake off these unnecessary thoughts. His gaze gradually turned cold and resolute. He turned to the eager Kiliarchs beside him and said, "We will follow Kui, but we must keep a distance of 1 li." The 5 or 6 Kiliarchs all nodded excitedly, their eyes burning. Jinqing suddenly laughed. "Brothers, don't forget those Qingqian on the grasslands. They are willing to pay a few hundred taels of silver for a cold blade. Ha, what a coincidence. There are more than 3,000 waiting for us to take. As for who can take more, it will depend on who can kill more Bailiang cavalry. I, Jinqing, will not break this rule just because I am a general's. Brothers, you can go kill without worry." 6 li away from the 1,600 Chong cavalry under Ku Qian, the 3,000 cavalry, all dressed in black armor and black horses, silently advanced forward at a uniform and powerful pace. An enormous black tiger was running around the periphery of the cavalry formation. The leader of the cavalry was a black-clothed youth who did not wear any armor. A cold blade rested on the horse's back in front of his chest, unsheathed. The general behind this half-horse was Scarface's man. He raised a metal spear at an angle with a fresh head hanging from the spearhead. It was the wandering scout who had been mixed in with the Chong cavalry. He had a sword and his swordsmanship was unknown. In any case, he had abandoned his horse and fled quite quickly. Unfortunately, no matter how fast he was, he could not outrun the spear that the black-clothed youth threw out. Before Scarface brushed past the corpse, he felt that he had nothing to do. After pulling out the spear from the corpse, he lightly cut off the head and stabbed it into the spear tip. Scarface was the Xiang army's valiant general Wang Lingbao. Originally, he shouldn't have appeared here. Instead, he should have obediently stayed near Azure City with Li Mofen, who was also a deputy general. They could only suppress their impatient tempers and slowly wait for that rotten old man surnamed Lu to bring a bunch of northern Mang trash with him to show off his strength. However, the commander had somehow heard from some scoundrel that a group of 8,000 Chong cavalry had broken through the border and was rushing to their deaths. Wang Lingbao wanted to kill these Chong cavalry who were tired of living, but the governor-general had sent an urgent military order to the Liuzhou provincial governor's mansion, telling the Xiang army not to move. Provincial Governor Yang Guangdou had even gone out of the city to scout the camp, smiling as he whispered some kind reminders into Li Mofen and Li Mofen's ears. Wang Lingbao naturally did not dare to disobey a military order. Let alone the new Prince Liang's order, even if it was just Chu Lushan's order, Wang Lingbao would not dare to move the troops on his own. However, since his commander wanted to kill people even if the sky fell down, the commander would be there to support it. How could Wang Lingbao miss out on this rare opportunity? In order to intercept and kill this group of Chong cavalry heading south, the 10,000 Dragon Elephant Light Cavalry had no choice but to split into 3 groups, each of them searching for the enemy between Qingcang City and Linyao Military Town. As the 10,000 troops set out, Yang Guangdou and the young scholar called Qin Shiliang quickly blocked their path, seemingly wanting to dissuade them. In any case, Wang Lingbao hid behind the army and picked his ears, pretending not to hear or see anything. As for the fact that the Xiang army had broken a taboo in the art of war, Wang Lingbao really did not think much of it. It was true that the Xiang army did not care about the situation in Liuzhou, but if one were to say that the 3,000 Xiang army would be at a disadvantage in front of 8,000 Chong cavalry, Wang Lingbao would be the first to cut off his own head and use it as a urinal. When Wang Lingbao saw the provincial governor, he was quite angry. If not for the fact that he could not defeat the commander, he would have definitely hit him. However, the scholar, who seemed to be highly regarded by the prince, did not have any obvious expression. Wang Lingbao actually knew that after returning to Qingcang City, the news of the Xiang army violating military orders would definitely reach the Huaiyang Pass Protectorate Manor. At that time, even if the commander of the Xiang army took the blame as a deputy general, Wang Lingbao would not be able to bear the consequences. However, so what? More than 10 years later, the true Liangmong Great War had finally arrived. Motherf *Ker, even a pregnant woman would only need 10 months to give birth. He and Li Mofen, these rough men, had waited bitterly for more than 10 years. In this first battle, if he, Wang Lingbao, did not take the lead, he would be the first to let himself down. As for why the young commander in front of him was so determined to fight the Chong cavalry, Wang Lingbao could not be bothered to care. Wang Lingbao let out a long breath. With a flick of his wrist, he shook off the head that was in the way. Looking into the distance between the two sides was less than 2 li. He could already see that the enemy cavalry had begun to speed up. Wang Lingbao softly muttered, "Beiliang is guarded by us. Great General, rest assured." Su Longxiang slowly pulled out his Beiliang saber. Under the illumination of the sun, it flashed with a snow-white light. At the same time, the 3,000 Dragon Elephant Cavalry began to raise their spears. Chapter 1277. The two cavalry armies began to charge at each other without any fancy moves. The terrain was flat and wide, making it easy for cavalry to spread out. Since it was an excellent place for cavalry battles, it also meant that it was easy for people to die here, and the speed at which they died would be very fast. The Chong cavalry were the lightest of the lightest cavalry. On one hand, they were so poor that they could not be heavy at all. On the other hand, their arms were long like apes and their strength was outstanding. This made almost every one of them a master archer on horseback. The young Chong Chiliarch Kui, who had a blood feud with the Beiliang Su family, finally stopped, purposely suppressing the charging speed of the cavalry. With a wave of his hand, he covered the eyes of his horse with a black cloth, and the speed of his steed suddenly increased. If there were spectators looking from a horizontal line, they would definitely be stunned by the muscles of these warhorses as they ran. The habit of covering the eyes of the horses during a charge had never been popular in the Central Plains, but this was an old custom that had been passed down for hundreds of years on the grasslands. At the beginning, it was to ensure that the warhorses would not be afraid when facing the infantry of the Central Plains, and at the same time to deliberately startle the warhorses. Before the fierce collision between cavalry armies, the cavalry would whip the warhorses to make them explode with greater strength, using the warhorses' speed to drive the cavalry's charge forward. However, among the elite cavalry armies in the world, perhaps only the Bailiang cavalry disdained to use this kind of insignificant skill. This was attributed to the fact that every horse in Bailiang had turned from raw to mature, and the large horse farms had poured in countless efforts. Of course, there was also countless amounts of silver. In northern Liang, every time a familiar horse stepped onto a large-scale battlefield, there would be one or even several warhorses that would die before it could do so. On the battlefield, only the roars of the 1,600 or so Chong cavalry could be heard. In comparison, the 3,000 Long Xiang army, who were also light cavalry, seemed especially strange at this time. One reason was that they were collectively silent before the battle, but more importantly, they were practically fugitives who used light cavalry as heavy cavalry. After the dragon elephant light cavalry raised their spears and charged, they charged straight at the enemy, even giving up on the lethality of a wave of light crossbows. The Bailiang cavalry was good at fighting and dared to fight to the death. The Central Plains had always been good at a combination of riding and walking when it came to war. The infantry was in the middle and the cavalry was on the two wings. The latter was not used to break through enemy lines head-on. Other than being limited by the natural factor of the cavalry bow being inferior to the infantry bow, especially the large crossbow, the main reason was that the cavalry's greatest advantage was its great mobility. In the long series of classic battles of the spring and autumn period, this indisputable pattern of war was displayed to the fullest extent. As long as it was a general who could be crowned as a famous general, even if it was an infantry commander, he would still be able to command a cavalry army of several thousand men in an orderly manner. This was probably the so-called chronic illness becomes a doctor. At that time, the large group of Li Yang's higher-level generals who had been influenced by the flames of war didn't know how to ride, or rather didn't know how to ride, so they were too embarrassed to greet their colleagues when they went out. However, this kind of combined riding and walking tactic, once they moved to a place where supplies were difficult, it was inevitable that they wouldn't be able to acclimatize. After the current emperor ascended the throne, he took the initiative to launch several great battles against Beimang, and he suffered enough. Many situations that seemed to be in a good situation at the beginning were ruined by some battles that occurred outside the main battlefield. Take Beimang's Tuoba Bodhisattva and Dong Zhuo, two generations of famous Beimang generals, for example. These two became famous by relying on their light cavalry, which could easily be as long as 1,000 li long-distance raids. In one breath, they circled around to the rear of Li Yang's army and directly smashed one or even several main supply lines. The famous generals of the Liang imperial court, especially the cavalry generals, were greatly vexed by this, but for some reason, there was never a genius general who was able to break away from the infantry and meet force with force against Beimang's cavalry. Even so, the signs of the cavalry having to be separated and assume independent responsibility, as well as a series of books on the art of war that were derived from it, still appeared. Lu Xingxiang, who had been recruited by Zhao Yi to go to the distant Guangling riverbank, and Su Gong, who had never had the chance to go on an expedition beyond the Great Wall, each produced a military book. Unfortunately, it was not passed down to the generations, but it was widely praised within the military. Su Shao greatly admired that dragon general Su Gong, who came from the Gumusu family, and thought that this person should have been able to overshadow Lu Xingxiang, who led the charge in the southeast. However, that group of Liang's higher-ups all knew in their hearts that if at that time Qin Jibao and Chu Lushan were given the opportunity, then in Beimang, this brand-new battlefield, these two would undoubtedly become meritorious figures not inferior to the four great generals of the spring and autumn period. However, at that time, even if the new son of heaven, out of selfishness, was willing to give Qin Jibao the opportunity to display his skills, that large group of founding elders would not allow the Su family to have a successor. In close to 20 years of constant warfare with Beimang, the Beimang cavalry also developed a set of extremely powerful and mature tactics. For example, the Beimang cavalry lacked crossbows but had many bows. Unless it was an elite soldier with astonishing strength, It would be difficult for an ordinary cavalry bow to break through the armor from 80 paces away. When the two armies collided and charged, under Qin Jibao's influence, the Beimang cavalry was abnormal to the point where they directly abandoned the crossbows in the process of exchanging fire. Relying on their advantage in armor, they allowed the Mang cavalry to throw out their arrows and fire at them, while their own side only focused on charging forward. As a result, Qin Jibao once made a presumptuous statement that made the outside world feel unimaginable. Under the premise that the military strength was roughly equal or even slightly inferior, the Beimang cavalry could only survive 40 paces. After all, outsiders were unable to witness this scene with their own eyes, and all along they held a strong skeptical attitude. However, it was undeniable that in the entire Liang dynasty, perhaps only the Beimang frontier army had the precious experience of more than 10,000 pure cavalry fighting in pairs with cavalry. Don't look at how the Zhou imperial court acted like they didn't know anything about the northwest border. Every time the wind blew and the grass blew, the current golden weaving bureau Li Shifeng would patiently and quietly send secret memorials to the capital. And the contents of these memorials were bought by Guangling Prince Zhao Yi and Yanqi Prince Zhao Bing through who knew how many favors and connections, so that the various advisors could ponder over and over again. At the same time, the Liang imperial court was not waiting for death. They decided to treat Beimang and Beiliang as imaginary enemies, thinking about how to truly go against the iron hooves of those war horses. After all, the outstanding generals of the Central Plains who stood out from the smoke of war were not useless people. They were quite effective. The division of troops and weapon combinations of the infantry and the cooperation of the weapons could be said to be at the peak of perfection. In the imperial examinations of the spring of Yonghui, there were even similar questions that had a deep meaning. This led to many bold and unconstrained ideas in the answers. Although most of them were seen as the nonsense of a scholar, there was an argument that suddenly shone brightly after many years of silence. That was to use extremes to fight extremes. The examinee who failed in the imperial examinations at that time proposed to invest all of his financial and material resources to develop the deformed heavy cavalry and strive to cross the threshold of 10,000 people. Even if he had to sell everything, he had to develop one or several heavy cavalry units and place them in an important town not far from the border. At that time, his answer sheet was like a clay ox in the ocean in the Liang imperial court. However, at the same time, the Beimang palace began to crazily use money to build heavy cavalry units. It was not until many years later that the Liang imperial court realized that these were the two units of cavalry that Beimang named after the country's surname, the Yelu heavy cavalry and the Murong heavy cavalry. The number of people barely touched the threshold of 10,000. However, even the layman civil official knew that to raise these two units of heavy cavalry, it was the same as cutting off the country's flesh and blood to feed these two large gluttons. This was because the true cost of the heavy cavalry was not in the establishment of the structure but in the maintenance of the soldiers. The Liang imperial court, who was slow to realize this, was forced by public opinion from all levels of society, especially Gu Lu of the Ministry of War and the Eastern Border Army. Only then did they bite the bullet and follow behind Beimang to create the Duoyen cavalry and the Yanmen heavy cavalry. The former had less than 8,000 cavalry and the latter had less than 5,000. As for why the scholar who went to the capital to take the imperial examinations would mysteriously die in a nameless alley, who cared? However, if someone knew of this secret, they would sigh. A little essay of less than 1,000 words written by a nameless Jiangnan scholar had actually affected the life and death of 2 million soldiers in the desert frontier fortress. The enemy was 80 paces away from us. The front line of battle spread out like a line. The surging tide of Chong cavalry skillfully knocked their bows and shot arrows. The violent jolting of the back of the horse during the fast charge, the armor of the enemy cavalry, and the lack of time to switch shots in a hurried battle were all important reasons why cavalry archery was only the icing on the cake. Beimang's proper border army's spears were not bad. Not to mention Dongzhu's Dong family army, even the generals and personal troops who held the edict had reached the level of the elite border army of Liang. However, this Chong cavalry was much more shabby. It was not that Beimang was so stingy that he was not willing to take out tens of thousands of refined spears. However, even if he gave them to the Chong cavalry who had their own set of tactics, it would only be drawing legs on a snake and not sending charcoal in snowy weather. The training of war horses was already a headache, much less the training of cavalry in horse battle. The weight of the spear and saber was related to the strength of the cavalry's arms. How many battles and how many lives would be sacrificed before an optimal answer could be found? The precise area of the spear to stab the enemy cavalry, the optimal angle of the saber, the appropriate weight of the armor were all different from person to person and required great knowledge. Therefore, if the Chang cavalry suddenly changed their main weapons to the overly extravagant and unfamiliar spears, and thus slowed down the speed of the Chang cavalry, then once the Chang cavalry reached Liuzhou, they would either be lucky and not run into the Longxiang army, or they would just treat it as a happy trip. If they were unlucky, then General Jin Qing would not even need to think about it. He would just turn and run and try to sell those spears for some money to escape. Those spring and autumn survivors who left their homes and fled north brought along many secret and superb forging techniques to Beimang. However, Beimang lacked a large amount of iron, causing many of the craftsmen of the southern dynasty to become hardworking housewives who could not cook without rice. Qin Jibao once said, "The northern barbarians who lack spears are just a group of foot soldiers on horseback, that's all."